Chapter 2149. Although Chu Fengmian had yet to step into the celestial realm, his current strength was already on par with immortal generals. It shouldn't be a problem for him to control the Taichu sword. With his current strength and control of the Taichu sword, Chu Fengmian was confident that he could fight even profound heaven realm immortal marquises. Chu Fengmian was well aware of the power of an extreme immortal weapon. The Emperor Jar in Chu Fengmian's hand was an extreme immortal weapon. Although it was an incomplete extreme immortal weapon, its power still surpassed most immortal weapons. Compared to the Emperor Jar, the Taichu sword was a complete extreme immortal weapon. Both its blade and hilt were in Chu Fengmian's possession. As long as the demonic intent on the Taichu sword was completely dispelled, he would be able to reconstruct it. Unfortunately, it would take at least half a month for the demonic intent to be completely dispelled. The upper sword sect's ruins would open in 4 days. He wouldn't be able to make it in time to compete for the upper sword sect's inheritance. However, even without the Taichu sword, Chu Fengmian was confident that he could compete for the upper sword sect's inheritance. His current strength was enough to sweep away immortal generals. More importantly, the warriors and Fey immortals who went to fight for the upper sword sect ruins were all sword cultivators without exception. If one was not a sword cultivator with an extremely high understanding of the way of the sword, one would not have the chance to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Strength was only one of the factors in a clash between sword cultivators. Comprehension of sword Dao and the clash of sword intents were the most important factors. Chu Fengmian had the confidence to fight against sword cultivators, even profound heaven realm immortal marquis. His sword intent was enough to sweep through all profound heaven realm sword cultivators. Although Chu Fengmian's strength hadn't reached the profound heaven realm, his sword intent could make up for it. This was also why he was confident in competing for the upper sword sect's inheritance. Chu Fengmian sat in Cloud Feather Palace with his eyes closed, comprehending the sword technique. The battle with the monochrome young lord had been the first time he'd used Sky Splitter of the Nine Realms sword art. He'd also gained some insight from that battle. In these 4 days, Chu Fengmian prepared to further refine his sword technique. 1 day later, a blood-soaked figure descended upon the Origin sword world. His clothes were tattered, and it was unknown how much blood he had been soaked in. His entire being looked like a bloody man. The figure stepped into the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace, came before the throne, and bowed respectfully. Sect Master, the Shenquan sect has been destroyed. This figure was none other than the Mad Dragon Emperor. On this day, the Mad Dragon Emperor rushed into the headquarters of the Shenquan sect and destroyed the whole Shenquan sect. He was holding a head in his hand, which was the head of the celestial being realm master of the Shenquan sect. Not bad. Chu Fengmian's eyes, which were sitting on the throne, suddenly opened and looked at the Mad Dragon Emperor. During this day, the aura on the Wild Dragon Emperor's body was much more overbearing than before. His strength was also completely different. A breakthrough? Chu Fengmian asked. He could see that the Mad Dragon Emperor had broken through from the immortal realm to the immortal warrior realm. The Mad Dragon Emperor's realm had been at the peak of the immortal realm for a long time, and he was looking for an opportunity to break through. This time, he finally comprehended something in the bloody battle with the Shenquan sect and stepped into the immortal warrior realm. I have comprehended something in this battle, the Mad Dragon Emperor said with a joyful face. You've worked hard. Take a rest first. Chu Fengmian looked at the Mad Dragon Emperor and said. The Mad Dragon Emperor's body was also heavily injured. Clearly, this battle was incomparably dangerous. Even though he was holding the Bai Feng sword, the Mad Dragon Emperor was injured. After all, the sect master of the Shenquan sect was a celestial being realm expert. In addition, if the Shenquan sect wanted to establish a sect in the 9 regions, they must have built a sect and set up countless restrictive formations in it. The Mad Dragon Emperor rashly barged in and faced the strength of the entire Xingquan sect. But in the end, he managed to kill his way out. However, it was also because of this that the Mad Dragon Emperor directly broke through. Yes. Hearing Chu Fengmian's words, the Mad Dragon Emperor turned around and returned to his cave to recuperate in seclusion. On one hand, he wanted to recover from his injuries. On the other hand, he needed to consolidate his strength after breaking through to the immortal warrior realm. In the Cloud Feather Palace, Qing Meng, Yan Hanshi, Emperor Yan, Luo He and the others were all in seclusion. They were only a step away from the celestial being realm. Chu Fengmian gave them countless sage pills, so that they could break through to the celestial being realm at any time. This seclusion was also to accumulate strength and prepare to break through the celestial tribulation. When the four of them step into the celestial being realm, the Sword Dao sect will have the ability to protect itself. Chu Fengmian mumbled to himself. In Chu Fengmian's opinion, the Sword Dao sect's strength was still too weak. Excluding Chu Fengmian, there were only Mad Dragon Emperor, Han Yueli, and Luo Shi, the three celestial being realm experts. If it was the previous 9 regions, such strength would definitely be enough to become the 8th largest sect in the 9 regions. But now, the 9 regions were full of experts. Almost every sect that dared to establish a sect in the 9 regions had several celestial being realm expert. In the 9 regions, the Sword Dao sect dominated the northern region. It would definitely attract the attention of others. Only by increasing their strength could they protect the Sword Dao sect. When Qing Meng, Yan Hanshi, Emperor Yan, and Luo He stepped into the celestial being realm, the Sword Dao sect would have a total of 7 celestial being realm experts. It should be enough to protect the Sword Dao sect. Sect Master, the people of Sky Reaching Pavilion are outside the Sword Origin world. They want to see you. After another day, when there was only 1.5 days left before the opening of the Sword Sect ruins, King Swordslayer suddenly came to Cloud Feather Palace and reported to Chu Fengmian respectfully. Sky Reaching Pavilion? Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed with surprise. Sky Reaching Pavilion was a force of the 9 regions. It was one of the largest chambers of commerce in the 9 regions. Sky Reaching Pavilion, the inn under Sky Reaching Pavilion, was the best inn in the 9 regions. Sky Reaching Pavilion would hold auctions every once in a while. Although it wasn't considered a sect, Sky Reaching Pavilion was something that even the 7 great sects of the 9 regions didn't dare to underestimate. Sky Reaching Pavilion had an extremely long history. As early as 10,000 years ago, it was already one of the largest chambers of commerce in the 9 regions. Its origins were incomparably mysterious. First, set a small goal. For example, 1 second. Remember, the bookstore. Chapter 2150. Even Chu Fengmian didn't know much about the Sky Reaching Pavilion. However, the Sky Reaching Pavilion only did business and didn't participate in the fights between cultivators. Therefore, Chu Fengmian didn't know much about the Sky Reaching Pavilion and had only done some business with them. When Chu Fengmian first met Luo Shi, she was in the Sky Reaching Pavilion. However, at that time, she had already obtained the inheritance of the 6 Paths Demon Gate. She was only hiding in the Sky Reaching Pavilion to investigate the secrets of the Sky Reaching Pavilion. I didn't expect the Sky Reaching Pavilion to interfere this time. Chu Fengmian originally thought that they were from some sect who also wanted to obtain the Sword Execution Token Chart. That was why they came to see Chu Fengmian under the pretext of paying a visit. Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been surprised if someone from the 7 great sects had come to see him at this time. However, Chu Fengmian hadn't expected it to be someone from the Sky Penetrating Pavilion. The Sky Reaching Pavilion only cares about benefits. The Upper Sword Enforcer token illustration is a priceless treasure. There's no need to elaborate on the benefits involved. It's not strange for the Sky Reaching Pavilion to interfere. Luo Shi said from the side. I'm afraid some experts have asked the sky-reaching pavilion to buy the upper sword enforcer token illustration. Interesting. Since they're here, let's meet. Chu Fengmian thought for a moment and smiled at the Sword Slayer monarch. Invite them in. Yes. The Sword Slayer king replied and left immediately. Chu Fengmian turned his head and looked at Luo Shi. How much do you know about the sky-reaching pavilion? Luo Shi had joined the sky-reaching pavilion before. Her understanding of the sky-reaching pavilion should be much better than Chu Fengmian. Since the sky-reaching pavilion was interfering, Chu Fengmian had to be careful. After all, the origin of the sky-reaching pavilion was extremely mysterious. Although the sky-reaching pavilion mainly did business, Chu Fengmian still had to be careful. I only know a little about the origin of the sky-reaching pavilion. However, the sky-reaching pavilion has a strong foundation. Back then, the Six Paths Demon Gate didn't dare to clash with the sky-reaching pavilion. It's said that the sky-reaching pavilion is backed by the Tianjiu domain, just like the 7 major sections. Luo Shi said in a deep voice. The sky-reaching pavilion isn't as simple as it seems. Is it related to the Tianjiu regions? Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered. This was beyond his expectations. Chu Fengmian originally thought that in the 9 regions, the only forces related to the 9 regions of heaven were the 7 major sects, but now it seemed that in addition to forces like the Cheetah sect, the Sky Span Pavilion, and even the Heavenly Chamber of Commerce, had unfathomable foundations. There were no weaklings among the forces that could continue to exist in the 9 regions. They all had their own foundations. While Chu Fengmian and Luo Shi were talking, the Sword Slayer King brought an elder into the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace. This time, the person from the sky-reaching pavilion did not come with a group of people like the Shengquan sect. Instead, he came alone. It was an old man dressed in luxurious clothes, and his demeanor exuded the aura of someone of high status. He was definitely an important figure in the Pavilion of Transcendence. Chu Fengmian's eyes lit up when he saw this old man. He had seen this old man before. The sky-reaching pavilion was the host of the martial competition in the North region. This old man was Su Qi, an important figure of the sky-reaching pavilion. Previously, when Chu Fengmian killed Yi Tianjun, Yi Mu ancestor suddenly attacked and wanted to kill Chu Fengmian. It was Su Qi who saved Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian still remembered this favor. Greetings, Sword Path Sect Master. Su Qi followed the Sword Slayer monarch and came to the front of the throne. He bowed respectfully to the sect master. Senior Su, you're welcome, Chu Fengmian said with a smile. Su Qi was one of the important figures of the sky-reaching pavilion. In the 9 regions, the major forces of the 9 regions had benefited greatly, and the sky-reaching pavilion was no exception. When Chu Fengmian saw Su Qi, he was still in the life and death steps realm. Now, he had reached the peak of the half-step celestial realm and was only 1 step away from the celestial realm. The drastic changes of the 9 regions and the emergence of countless treasures had also increased the strength of the experts of the 9 regions by leaps and bounds. Although Chu Fengmian's strength was far beyond Su Qi's, Chu Fengmian would not forget the favor from before. Therefore, he still called him senior. I didn't expect the Sword Path Sect Master to still remember this old man. Su Qi was stunned when he heard Chu Fengmian's greeting, but then he said with a smile, "This old man can't afford to be called senior now. I'm now an elder of the sky-reaching pavilion, the 11th elder. If Sect Master doesn't mind, you can call me senior." "All right." Chu Fengmian nodded and accepted the greeting. 11th elder? I didn't expect Elder Su to have already entered the sky-reaching council. Luo Shi, who was beside Chu Fengmian, said in surprise when she heard Su Qi's words. "Oh? Vice Sect Master Luo knows a lot about the sky-reaching pavilion." Su Qi looked at Luo Shi, who was no stranger to him. In the Sword Path sect, Chu Fengmian was the most mysterious sect master, especially when he had left the 9 regions for the vast sea starfield. Hanueli and Luo Shi were in charge of all the matters of the Sword Path sect. These two vice sect masters were extremely famous in the 9 regions. As for Chu Fengmian, he had only made a name for himself 2 days ago when he had subdued Elder Holy Spring and killed the Black and White Lord. Before this, very few cultivators of the 9 regions knew who the Sword Dao School's sect master was. I've only heard some rumors. Luo Shi didn't say much and turned to Chu Fengmian. Now that Elder Su has entered the Sky Reaching Council, he's a true senior member of the Sky Reaching Pavilion. He can represent the Sky Reaching Pavilion. Although Luo Shi's words were simple, Chu Fengmian could tell that the Sky Reaching Council was the highest level of the Sky Reaching Pavilion. Although Su Qi's position was high before, he wasn't qualified to join the Sky Reaching Council. Now that Su Qi had entered the Sky Reaching Council, he was at the highest level of the Sky Reaching Pavilion. His position was even higher than that of an elder. This time, the Sky Reaching Pavilion had sent Su Qi to show their sincerity. Congratulations on your promotion, Elder Su. Chu Fengmian smiled. It seemed that the Sky Reaching Pavilion had come for Chu Fengmian because of the Sword Enforcer token chart. After all, Chu Fengmian didn't have anything else on him that was worth an elder of the Sky Reaching Council. I was just lucky. Su Qi smiled. May I know why Elder Su has come this time? Chu Fengmian changed the topic and went straight to the point. End of chapter. Chapter 2151. Chu Fengmian didn't believe that Su Qi had come just to catch up with him. Although Chu Fengmian and Su Qi had only met once, there was no reason for Su Qi to come all the way here alone to catch up. I'm here for the upper sword execution chart. When Su Qi heard Chu Fengmian's words, he didn't waste any more time and went straight to the point. Actually, the Sky Reaching Pavilion was asked to come by someone. Su Qi added as he finished his sentence. Asked to come by someone? Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed. He knew that Su Qi must have come for the upper sword execution chart, but what he said next was beyond his expectations. The Sky Reaching Pavilion's origin was extremely mysterious. On the surface, it was just a chamber of commerce, so it naturally wasn't worth much attention. Furthermore, the Sky Reaching Pavilion didn't occupy any territory or city, so it didn't have much interaction with the martial artists and Yao gods from the outer realm. Therefore, the person who asked the Sky Reaching Pavilion shouldn't be a force from the outer realm, but a force from the 9 regions. Since the Sky Reaching Pavilion was asked to talk to Chu Fengmian, it naturally wouldn't be good for them to show up. Moreover, it was very likely that they had a grudge against Chu Fengmian. Oh? Let me guess. Is it someone from the 7 great sects, the 6 demonic sects, or the Tianjian sect? Chu Fengmian thought for a moment and smiled. In the 9 regions, only the 7 great sects were Chu Fengmian's enemies and couldn't show up. Among the 7 great sects, only the 6 demonic sects and the Tianjian sect had swordsmanship inheritances and powerful sword cultivators. The other 5 great sects didn't have any powerful sword cultivators qualified to fight for the upper sword sect's swordsmanship inheritance. The upper sword sect's swordsmanship inheritance could only be obtained by extremely powerful sword cultivators. If one wasn't a sword cultivator, even if they obtained the inheritance, they wouldn't be able to comprehend the swordsmanship. Even if they did obtain it, it would be a waste of effort. Chu Fengmian thought for a while. The 6 demonic sects and the Tianjian sect were the only 2 possibilities. Sect Master Chu is right. Su Qi gasped when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Chu Fengmian had already guessed who it was that had asked the Sky-Piercing Pavilion to discuss the upper sword execution chart with Chu Fengmian. It's the upper sword sect. This time, I'm here to talk to you about the upper sword sect's upper sword execution chart, Su Qi said directly. This time, the sect leader of the upper sword sect has asked us of the Sky Reaching Pavilion to pay a visit to sect leader Chu. We would like to ask young Master Chu to hand over the upper sword sect's executor's portrait. Of course, there will be a reward for the transfer of the portrait. As for what the reward is, young Master Chu can name it. Although Su Chi said that he was here on behalf of the sky-reaching pavilion, it was more like he had accepted a commission from the sword sect. It had little to do with him, so he was very frank and did not hide anything. Up the sect up. The is. To be. Chu Fengmian looked at Su Chi and waved his hand. A Sword Dao sect disciple came over and offered him a cup of tea. Chu Fengmian sipped the tea and said with a smile, I don't think the upper sword sect will pay for what I want. Sect Master Chu, please tell me. Su Chi said calmly. He was not in a hurry. He also knew the value of the upper sword execution chart. At the very least, Chu Fengmian's upper sword execution chart had cost the lives of 3 immortal generals. It was a treasure that could make immortal generals go crazy. Su Chi knew how valuable it was. He would be surprised if Chu Fengmian directly handed over the upper sword execution chart. Chu Fengmian's reaction was very normal. The Tianjian sect had asked the sky-reaching pavilion to negotiate with Chu Fengmian. They were prepared to pay a great price. This is a drop of blood essence of the ancient war dragon. The Tianjian sect's sect master gave it to me to pass to you. Su Chi suddenly opened his empty ring and took out a jade bottle. He handed it to Chu Fengmian. Inside the jade bottle was a drop of blood essence with a chaotic color. It was a drop of blood essence from the ancestral sky dragon, the blood essence of an innate divine beast. The upper sword sect had taken out this drop of blood essence during the 9 regions genius battle. It originally belonged to Chu Fengmian. However, Chu Fengmian fought a bloody battle with the demon emperor and completely fell out with the 7 great sects. As a result, Chu Fengmian left. In the end, the primogenitor Tianlong's blood essence and the myriad treasure Heavenly Jade Talisman were kept by the Tianjian sect. This time, the Tianjian sect took out this drop of blood essence again and gave it to Chu Fengmian. You want to exchange a drop of primogenitor Tianlong's blood essence for the upper sword execution chart? Chu Fengmian didn't take the jade bottle. Instead, he looked at it with disdain. Although primogenitor Tianlong's blood essence was useful to Chu Fengmian, it wasn't that useful anymore. After all, Chu Fengmian had devoured one of Tianlong's dragon claws. The power it contained was equivalent to tens of thousands of drops of blood essence. Chu Fengmian didn't really care about this drop of blood essence. Sect Master Chu, you misunderstand. This drop of blood essence is just a greeting gift from the Tianjian sect's sect master. Regardless of whether this exchange is successful or not, it's still a gift to sect Master Chu. Su Chi looked at Chu Fengmian and smiled. You're quite sincere. Hearing this, Chu Fengmian took the jade bottle. Although this drop of primogenitor Tianlong's blood essence wasn't invaluable, it could easily be exchanged for a few immortal stones. It seemed that this time, the Tianjian sect really wanted the upper sword execution token chart. That was why they didn't hesitate to take out primogenitor Tianlong's blood essence as a greeting gift. It could be said that they wanted to curry favor with Chu Fengmian. After all, the upper sword execution token chart was currently in Chu Fengmian's hands. For the Tianjian sect, if they wanted to obtain the upper sword execution token chart, they would have to negotiate with Chu Fengmian and get him to hand it over voluntarily. As for robbing them by force, the Skysword sect had seen what had happened to the monochrome young lord. After the monochrome young lord's death, they gave up on the idea and went to the sky-piercing pavilion to persuade them. Sect Master Chu, you must have seen the Tianjian sect's sincerity. As for the conditions of the upper sword execution token chart, there's no harm in Sect Master Chu stating them. Su Chi looked at Chu Fengmian and continued. The Tianjian sect is determined to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword execution token chart. At this time, if young Master Chu is willing to give up the upper sword execution token chart, you will certainly receive great benefits. Elder Su, there's no need to beat around the bush. I've already told you the Tianjian sect's conditions. Just say it. There's no need to waste time. Chu Fengmian looked at Su Qi and said with a smile. Chapter 2152. Chu Fengmian had seen through Su Qi's intentions. He should have known about the Tianjian sect's conditions, but Su Qi hadn't explained it clearly. He wanted Chu Fengmian to state his conditions first. If Chu Fengmian's conditions were within the scope of the Tianjian sect's conditions, he could easily agree. As for the rest of the reward, he could keep it for himself. The sky-reaching pavilion only did things for profit. Chu Fengmian was very clear about this. The upper sword execution token chart was related to the inheritance of the upper sword sect. No swordsman would willingly give it up, and Chu Fengmian was no exception. He wanted to create the world's first swordsmanship, control the origin of swordsmanship, and obtain the most ancient swordsmanship of the upper sword sect. Therefore, no matter what the Tianjian sect offered, Chu Fengmian had no intention of giving up the upper sword execution token chart. However, since Su Qi had come today on behalf of the Tianjian sect, Chu Fengmian was somewhat curious. What price was the Tianjian sect willing to pay for the upper sword execution token chart? According to some ancient records, the rise of the Tianjian sect had something to do with the upper sword sect. It was said that the Tianjian sect had obtained part of the upper sword sect's swordsmanship, which ultimately led to the rise of the Tianjian sect. This saying wasn't nonsense. If it was true, it meant that the Tianjian sect had a deeper understanding of the upper sword sect. The greater the price the Tianjian sect was willing to pay for the upper sword execution token chart, the greater the value of the upper sword execution token chart. Chu Fengmian was willing to continue negotiating with Su Qi because he wanted to see how much the Tianjian sect was willing to pay. Since Su Qi had been trying to hide something, Chu Fengmian decided to get straight to the point. Sect Master Chu, you saw through this old man's intentions at a glance. Su Qi smiled when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He wasn't embarrassed. Everyone knew the sky-reaching pavilion's way of doing things, so it wasn't strange that Chu Fengmian had seen through it. To be honest, the price that the Tianjian sect offered this time is tempting even for me. When Su Qi said this, there was no falsehood in his tone. Even with his status, he was surprised by the Tianjian sect's offer. Chu Fengmian didn't say anything and waited for Su Qi to continue. 1 sword Dao totem, 100 heaven-tier spiritual swords to form a sword array, and 3 immortal-tier spiritual swords. Su Qi said in a deep voice. These are the conditions offered by the Tianjian sect. As for the other things, if Sect Master Chu needs them, we can discuss them further. 1 sword Dao totem, 100 heaven-grade spirit swords to form a sword array, and 3 immortal-grade spirit swords? Chu Fengmian repeated the 3 conditions in his mind. He couldn't help but be startled. These conditions were too generous. Although the upper sword execution token chart was related to the inheritance of the upper sword sect and was priceless, it did not mean that the upper sword execution token chart represented the inheritance of the upper sword sect. The upper sword execution map only represented a chance to fight for the inheritance of the upper sword sect's sword technique. It was just a chance. There were a total of 12 upper sword execution tokens charts, and the one in Chu Fengmian's hand was only one of them. If the Tianjian sect was willing to pay such a high price for the upper sword execution token chart, then the Tianjian sect would be willing to pay a price hundreds of times higher than this for the true inheritance of the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian guessed that the Tianjian sect was willing to use the sky-reaching pavilion as a lobbyist. Obviously, the rewards offered were very generous. However, these 3 conditions still surprised Chu Fengmian. These conditions are just for the upper sword execution token chart? What a generous offer. Not only Chu Fengmian but also Han Yueli and Luo Shi, who were beside him, were stunned after hearing these conditions. The generous offer offered by the Tianjian sect was also beyond their expectations. The sword array formed by 100 heaven-grade spirit swords was nothing. But there were 2 other conditions. 3 immortal spirit swords. 3 immortal spirit swords were not as common as cabbages. For many forces in the extraterritorial starry sky, having even 1 immortal spirit sword was already a big deal. Even some immortal generals who had been famous for a long time only had 1 immortal artifact at most. Now, the Tianjian sect offered 3 immortal spirit swords. The Tianjian sect's foundation is really frightening. The 7 sects of the 9 territories all had frightening foundations. It was even rumored that they were all related to the 9 territories. The fact that the Tianjian sect could casually offer 3 immortal spirit swords showed the strength of the Tianjian sect's foundation. It was no wonder that the 7 sects could still stand tall in the midst of the upheaval of the 9 territories. This was the foundation of a sect. The last sword principal totem was actually the most valuable item among the rewards offered by the Tianjian sect. The sword principal totem was the most precious treasure of the sword principal. Its value was even higher than the supreme sword chi. If all the sword principal totems were added together, they would be even more valuable than the inheritance of the sword sect. Others might not know this, but Chu Fengmian had several sword principal totems in his hands. He knew the value of the sword principal totems very well. In particular, the incomplete swordsmanship hidden in the sword principal totem was related to the origin of the sword principal. The origin of the sword principal, which countless experts of the sword principle yearned for, was recorded in the sword principle totem. Although it was only a sword principle totem, its value was far greater than the 3 immortal spirit sword. The Tianjian sect had put in a lot of effort to get the sword execution token totem. They had actually offered such generous conditions. When this old man heard about this condition, even I was somewhat moved. If it weren't for the fact that our Sky Span Pavilion didn't manage to obtain an upper sword execution token, I'm afraid that our Sky Span Pavilion would have long sold it to the Heavenly Sword sect. Su Chi also couldn't help but sigh. He wasn't being hypocritical. This generous condition was unprecedented. It was all for the sword execution token totem. It seems that the Heavenly Sword sect is determined to obtain the upper sword enforcer token illustration. Chu Fengmian exclaimed. His face was full of amazement, but in his mind, he was also analyzing the reason why the Tianjian sect was willing to pay such a huge price. Although Chu Fengmian didn't intend to sell the sword execution token totem from the very beginning, he could see the value of the sword execution token totem from the Tianjian sect's attitude. Since the Tianjian sect was willing to pay such a huge price, the benefits that the Tianjian sect would receive after obtaining the sword execution token totem would definitely be much greater than the price they paid. Otherwise, the Tianjian sect would never have done this. End of chapter. Chapter 2153. Chu Fengmian's understanding of the sword sect was limited to the records in ancient book. Other than that, Chu Fengmian's understanding of the sword sect was even less than that of the sword cultivators in the extraterritorial starry sky. However, the Tianjian sect had a deep understanding of the sword sect. Since the Tianjian sect felt that the upper sword execution token chart was so valuable, Chu Fengmian naturally wouldn't give it up. Moreover, the Tianjian sect was one of the 7 major sects. The Tianjian sect was also involved in the siege of the Master of the Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian would destroy the 7 major sects sooner or later. If he sold the upper sword execution token chart to the Tianjian sect now, it would increase the strength of the enemy. If the Tianjian sect obtained the inheritance of the upper sword sect, it would be extremely troublesome. The temporary peace between Chu Fengmian and the 7 major sects was also due to the upheaval in the 9 zones. Countless experts from the extraterritorial starry sky were a threat to the 7 major sects. Therefore, the 7 major sects had no time to deal with Chu Fengmian. However, when things calmed down, the 7 major sects would deal with Chu Fengmian first. "What do you think, Sect Master Chu?" Su Qi asked when he saw that Chu Fengmian hadn't spoken. "I won't sell the upper sword execution token diagram. Tell the people of the Sky Sword sect that I won't sell the upper sword execution token diagram unless the Sky Sword sect takes out 5 sword totems." Chu Fengmian looked at Su Qi and said, "This is the only condition. If the Tianjian sect agrees, I'm willing to give the upper sword execution token chart to the Tianjian sect." Su Qi smiled bitterly when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Chu Fengmian's words were indeed not a direct rejection, but in reality, it was no different from a direct rejection. 5 sword Dao totems. Su Qi knew that the Tianjian sect wouldn't agree. He didn't even need to ask. The upper sword executor token portrait was related to the inheritance of the upper sword sect. It was indeed a priceless treasure. However, a sword Dao totem was also a sword Dao treasure. The value of a sword Dao totem was no less than an upper sword executor token portrait. This time, the Tianjian sect was willing to take out a sword principal totem as a reward for the trade. It could be said that they had put in a lot of effort. But now Chu Fengmian had asked for 5. This was simply an exorbitant demand. "Sect Master Chu, what's your condition?" Su Qi still wanted to say something but was interrupted by Chu Fengmian. "Elder Su, this is my only condition. If the Tianjian sect agrees, I am willing to complete the deal. But if they don't agree, then don't blame me." Chu Fengmian said directly. The meaning behind Chu Fengmian's words was clear. Chu Fengmian had no intention of selling the upper sword execution order chart. However, in order to give face to the sky-penetrating pavilion, Chu Fengmian didn't directly refuse. He only proposed a sky-high price. If the Tianjian sect didn't agree to this condition, it had nothing to do with Chu Fengmian. "I'll pass on Sect Master Chu's words to the Tianjian sect right away." Su Qi also understood the meaning behind Chu Fengmian's words. He immediately turned around and prepared to leave. As he left, he still looked a little disappointed. "Elder Su, wait." Just as Su Qi was about to walk out of the Cloud Feather Palace, Chu Fengmian suddenly called out to him. Su Qi stopped when he heard Chu Fengmian's voice. "Is there anything else, Sect Master Chu? I also intend to do business with the sky-penetrating pavilion." Chu Fengmian got straight to the point. When the word business was mentioned, Su Qi's eyes lit up. Then, the disappointment on his face disappeared. "What kind of business does Sect Master Chu intend to do with the sky-penetrating pavilion?" "A batch of materials, cultivation methods, elixirs, and so on. I think the sky-penetrating pavilion should be able to offer a fair price." Chu Fengmian's palm moved, and an empty ring appeared in his hand. It flew directly to Su Qi. The empty ring contained the spoils Chu Fengmian had obtained from the empty rings of many powerhouses he had killed. There were a total of 4 experts who had died at Chu Fengmian's hands. The Tianxing Jiendi, the ancestor of Martial Ghost, and the Black and White Lords were the masters of their respective sections. They were the giants of their respective forces and had extremely high statuses. Their empty rings also contained a large number of treasures. Of these treasures, some were useful to Chu Fengmian, and Chu Fengmian had kept them all. However, there were still many materials, cultivation methods, and elixirs that weren't suitable for Chu Fengmian and the Sword Dao sect. In Chu Fengmian's hands, they were meaningless. Since he had met Su Qi today, it was a good opportunity to sell these things to the sky-penetrating pavilion. The sky-penetrating pavilion was one of the largest chambers of commerce in the 9 regions. Although the pile of things in Chu Fengmian's hands was extremely valuable, it wouldn't be a problem for the sky-penetrating pavilion to take them all. It's best if these things are settled in immortal stones. Chu Fengmian threw them into the empty ring and added, "Settled in immortal stones?" Su Qi's expression changed slightly when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He naturally knew the value of immortal stones. Even for celestial realm experts, one immortal stone was priceless. In the 9 regions, few people who did business with the sky-penetrating pavilion would settle in immortal stones. After all, it was extremely rare for an ordinary transaction to reach the value of dozens of immortal stones. This was after the upheaval of the 9 regions, where countless treasures and immortal stones had appeared. If it had been before the upheaval of the 9 regions, an immortal stone transaction would have been a big business for the sky-penetrating pavilion. Judging from Chu Fengmian's tone, it was obvious that this was definitely a big business deal. However, in Su Qi's opinion, the rise of the Sword Dao sect had only happened recently. They didn't have much of a foundation at all, so how many treasures could they have accumulated? He had some doubts in his heart. However, Su Qi didn't show it. Instead, he directly injected a stream of spiritual power into the empty ring and opened it. This empty ring was an ownerless item. It wasn't engraved with Chu Fengmian's mark, so anyone could open it at will. Su Qi opened the empty ring and looked inside. It was full of treasures, cultivation techniques, materials, sacred pills, spiritual weapons, and so on. It was piled up like a mountain. These treasures were more than the treasures of a sect. However, there was more than one sect that had been destroyed by Chu Fengmian. The 6 sects that had besieged the Sword Dao sect had all been destroyed by Chu Fengmian. Their treasuries had all been taken by Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian had also killed 4 immortal generals. In addition, Kuang Long had just attacked and destroyed the Shenquan sect. The treasures in the Shenquan sect's treasury were also taken by Chu Fengmian. Although some of the treasures were useful to Chu Fengmian and the Sword Dao sect, Chu Fengmian had kept them for himself. However, the remaining treasures were more than 3 times the treasures in the Shenquan sect's treasury. End of chapter. Chapter 2154. Not only were there a lot of treasures, but the quality of the treasures in the ring was also very high. Many of the treasures in the ring were obtained by Chu Fengmian from the 4 immortal generals. The fact that they were kept in the ring by the immortal generals was enough to prove their value. Looking at the mountain of treasures in the empty ring, Su Qi's brows furrowed tightly. The number of treasures in the empty ring far exceeded what he had. With such a large transaction, it would be difficult for him to settle it all by himself. Moreover, there were so many treasures that it would be a huge number of immortal stones. Even Su Qi didn't have so many immortal stones with him. Sect Master Chu, if all of these treasures are settled in immortal stones, I'm afraid our sky-reaching pavilion won't be able to take them out in a short time. Su Qi hesitated for a moment and then said to Chu Fengmian. He did a little calculation. If all the treasures in the ring were exchanged for immortal stones, it would be at least tens of thousands of immortal stones. Although the sky-reaching pavilion was one of the largest chambers of commerce in the 9 regions, it was still too much for them to take out tens of thousands of immortal stones in one go. Hearing Su Qi's words, Chu Fengmian thought for a moment and then said, "In addition to immortal stones, if there are any sword techniques or sword manuals, you can also trade them." Chu Fengmian was selling these materials in exchange for immortal stones in order to increase his strength. This time, going to the remains of the Upper Sword sect to compete for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect would definitely be a fierce battle between wolves and tigers. The 12 Upper Sword execution token diagrams had all appeared. Apart from Chu Fengmian, the masters of the Upper Sword execution token diagrams were all immortal generals. Many of them were even invincible among the immortal generals. Their strength was even more powerful than that of Tianxing Jiandi. Among the 12 sword cultivators who obtained the Upper Sword execution token portraits, only one could truly obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. One could imagine how fierce the battle would be. Although Chu Fengmian's strength wasn't inferior to that of ordinary immortal generals, he still had to improve his strength to compete for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect was very important. If Chu Fengmian wanted to create the world's best sword technique, he had to obtain the Upper Sword Sect's unparalleled sword technique. There was only one chance, so Chu Fengmian had to be fully prepared. The Pavilion of Transcendence had been doing business in the 9 regions for tens of thousands of years. They should have accumulated quite a number of sword techniques and sword manuals. If these sword techniques were all integrated into the 9 regions' sword arts, they would also be able to increase Chu Fengmian's strength. It would be best if they were rare and eccentric swordsmanship manuals. The grade is not a problem. I want all of them. Chu Fengmian looked at Su Qi and reminded him. For Chu Fengmian, the stranger and rarer the swordsmanship, the more suitable it was for the 9 realms' swordsmanship. For example, Chu Fengmian had obtained many ordinary swordsmanships and had integrated them into the 9 realms' swordsmanship. These rare and strange swordsmanships were what Chu Fengmian needed. Su Qi was puzzled by Chu Fengmian's request. He thought Chu Fengmian would ask for some powerful sword arts, some high-quality heaven-class immortal arts, or even immortal arts. But now, Chu Fengmian actually asked for those extremely rare and eccentric swordsmanships that were difficult to cultivate. For a moment, he did not understand Chu Fengmian's intention. However, there were indeed many such eccentric swordsmanships in the Pavilion of Transcendence. This was because ordinary sword cultivators would not buy such swordsmanships that were difficult to cultivate. After tens of thousands of years of accumulation, there were indeed many such eccentric and difficult swordsmanship. If Chu Fengmian was willing to ask for them, he was more than happy to do so. Young Master Chu, I need to return to Thousand Merchant City to gather immortal stones. Su Qi looked at Chu Fengmian and said hesitantly. This empty ring. You can take it with you, but I don't have much time. You must come back within a day. Chu Fengmian said with a smile. He also knew the value of the treasures in the empty ring. If Su Qi were to count them alone, it would be impossible for him to do so in a short time. Su Qi wanted to take the empty ring to Thousand Merchant City, which was the headquarters of the Pavilion of Transcendence. Chu Fengmian did not stop him. Chu Fengmian was not worried that Su Qi would take the empty ring for himself. The Pavilion of Transcendence had always valued reputation when doing business. Su Qi was now an important figure in the Pavilion of Transcendence. Naturally, he would not take the empty ring for himself. However, Chu Fengmian could only give Su Qi 1 day. 1.5 days later, the Upper Sword Sect ruins would be opened. Chu Fengmian needed to leave at least half a day in advance to make preparations. Therefore, he only left Su Qi 1 day. Many thanks. Su Qi's face lit up when he saw that Chu Fengmian was so agreeable. He immediately promised Chu Fengmian, I will be back within a day. After saying that, Su Qi turned and left. He turned into a beam of light and hurried back to Thousand Merchant City. As for Chu Fengmian, he quietly stayed in Cloud Feather Palace, comprehending swordsmanship with his eyes closed. Su Qi's speed was extremely fast. After only half a day, 2 beams of light arrived at the edge of the Origin Sword World. One of the beams of light was Su Qi. Chu Fengmian opened the door to the Origin Sword World and brought Su Qi in. However, Su Qi did not come alone this time. He was followed by a white-haired elder. This white-haired elder was incomparably old. No one knew how many years he had lived. At a glance, he seemed to be nearing the end of his life. This was the first impression everyone had when they saw the elder. However, there was a completely different aura on the elder. His aura contained surging vitality that was even stronger than the vitality of a man in his prime. One look at life and one look at death. Chu Fengmian could tell that the elder cultivated an extremely ancient withered Zen Dao. Although he looked old, once he attacked, The strength that erupted from his body was much stronger than that of many cultivators in their prime. Moreover, the elder's realm was extremely high. So strong. Luo Shi and Han Yueli exclaimed at the same time when they saw the elder. Han Yueli and Luo Shi could only sense the elder's strength, but they could not clearly see the elder's realm. Only Chu Fengmian could tell that the elder was an immortal general expert. He was even a peak immortal general whose strength was not below that of the Black and White Lords. Sky-piercing Pavilion's foundation was indeed profound. There were crouching tigers and hidden dragons. They only had one immortal general expert. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. If he had only speculated about Sky-piercing Pavilion's foundation before, the elder's appearance now proved everything. Chapter 2155. Sky-reaching Pavilion was indeed mysterious and profound. There were even some extremely powerful existences hidden in it. The major forces in the extraterritorial starry sky would never have thought that a chamber of commerce in the 9 regions would have such a deep foundation. The old man's status was obviously very high in Sky-reaching Pavilion. Even Su Qi, who had joined the Sky-reaching Council, had to be respectful when leading him. As soon as the old man stepped into the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace, a surge of life force emanated from him. Everyone in the Cloud Feather Palace felt as though they were bathed in a spring breeze and were in high spirits. Sect Master Chu, let me introduce you. This is the Great Elder of Sky-reaching Pavilion. Su Qi came to the front of the throne and introduced him to Chu Fengmian. The Great Elder. Hearing Su Qi's introduction, Chu Fengmian looked at the old man in surprise. The highest level of the Sky-penetrating Pavilion was the Sky-penetrating Council. The higher the number of elders, the higher their status. The position of the Sky-penetrating Pavilion's Great Elder was even higher than that of the Sky-penetrating Pavilion's Pavilion Master. He didn't expect Su Qi to bring the Sky-penetrating Pavilion's Great Elder with him. With the Great Elder here, Su Qi didn't have anything to do with this transaction. After introducing the Great Elder, he stepped back and stood respectfully behind the Great Elder. I've heard of Sect Master Chu's name for a long time. Today, I finally get to meet you. The Great Elder looked at Chu Fengmian and said in a very polite tone. He didn't have the arrogance of an immortal general. However, this was also because of the strength that Chu Fengmian had shown. If Chu Fengmian was just an ordinary half-step celestial realm warrior, the Great Elder wouldn't have been so polite. The reason for his politeness was because of the strength that Chu Fengmian had shown. Now, in the entire 9 regions, no one would treat Chu Fengmian as an ordinary half-step celestial realm warrior. After all, no matter what strength Chu Fengmian had borrowed, he had killed the Black and White Lords, which was enough to establish his prestige. You're welcome, Great Elder. Please take a seat. Chu Fengmian said with a smile. The 2 Sword Dao sect disciples beside him carried 2 chairs and placed them at the side for the First Elder and Su Qi to sit. I didn't expect that the First Elder would be alerted this time around. Chu Fengmian took a glance at the Great Elder and spoke first. The Sky Span Pavilion's Grand Elder's status could be said to be one of the highest in the Sky Span Pavilion. His status was transcendent, and when the Sky Span Pavilion did business, there was no need for the elders of the Sky Span Assembly to step in. The reason why Su Qi came to talk to Chu Fengmian about the Sword Execution Order map was because it was entrusted by the Tianjian sect, especially by the Tianjian sect's sect leader. The Tianjian sect was one of the 9 zones' 7 great sects. Even the Sky-reaching Pavilion dared to slight them. However, the only one who had come was Su Qi, a newly promoted elder of the Skyspan Council. This time, the First Elder had suddenly arrived. Su Qi's status was nothing in front of the First Elder. This made Chu Fengmian somewhat curious about the Sky-penetrating Pavilion's actions. Could it be that the First Elder is also here for the Sword Execution Order map? Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered as he looked at the first elder and asked tentatively. The sword execution order map had great implications. Given the sky-reaching pavilion's standing and usual style of conduct, they would never take the initiative to seize it or interfere. However, if the benefits were great enough, anything was possible. The first elder's strength wasn't inferior to the monochrome young master's. Moreover, his path of withered meditation was even more mysterious than the monochrome young master's swordsmanship. Chu Fengmian's eyes were incomparably cautious as he watched the first elder's every move, ready to make a move at any time. Sect Master Chu, you don't have to be so cautious. I've already informed the Skysword sect of your answer regarding the upper sword execution order diagram. This matter no longer has anything to do with our sky-reaching pavilion. The first elder understood the meaning behind Chu Fengmian's words and smiled. This time, I've only come to make a deal with sect leader Chu. Chu Fengmian relaxed a little when he heard the first elder's words. Given the first elder's status, he wouldn't lie to Chu Fengmian at such a time. Moreover, this was the Origin Sword world. With the help of the origin energy of the Sword Origin world, Chu Fengmian was confident that even if a profound Heaven Realm Immortal Marquis were to come, he wouldn't be able to defeat him. In the Origin Sword world, even a profound Heaven Realm Immortal Marquis wouldn't be able to gain the slightest advantage over Chu Fengmian. Although the first elder's strength was unfathomable, Chu Fengmian could see that he hadn't stepped into the Immortal Marquis realm yet. We've already counted the items that sect leader Chu gave us. If converted to immortal stones, they're worth a total of 45,000 immortal stones. The first elder waved his hand and a list appeared in his hand. It flew to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian glanced at the list. It recorded the value of each treasure in the spatial ring. The value of each treasure in the spatial ring was densely listed on the list. Chu Fengmian casually glanced at a few of them. They were all very fair, so he counted them and put them away. All right, we'll go with this price. Chu Fengmian nodded. However, sect leader Chu has said that the price can be offset by sword manuals and sword art. This old man has also brought a batch of sword art. Please take a look. The first elder waved his hand and another spatial ring appeared. It flew to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian opened the spatial ring. Inside the spatial ring were countless sword techniques, sword manuals, and recorded media. They were all different. There were books made of paper, beast skin, and even some books made of metal. Many of these sword arts and sword manuals had been passed down from an incomparably ancient era. It wasn't uncommon for some sects to use metal manuals or spiritual jades to record their martial arts and cultivation techniques for thousands of years to pass down. Chu Fengmian was already used to it. With a thought, hundreds of sword arts and sword manuals were flipped open. Chu Fengmian read 10 lines at a glance. With his current understanding of sword principles, he could see the mysteries of ordinary sword arts with just a few glances. He could even read hundreds of sword arts and sword manuals in one breath. Even so, Chu Fengmian spent a full 10 minutes to roughly read through the sword manuals and sword arts in the spatial ring. After all, there were more than 10,000 sword manuals and sword arts in the spatial ring. Moreover, there were some extremely high-level sword art. It wasn't easy for Chu Fengmian to comprehend them. Of course, this was just a rough look. It would take a long time to completely comprehend them. End of chapter. Chapter 2156. Most of them were obscure, complicated, and unorthodox swordsmanship. These swordsmanship were not popular in the 9 regions. For example, there were very few such sword arts in the Sword Dao sect's library. Chu Fengmian had never heard of many of them, so they could be integrated into the 9 regions' sword art. I'll buy all the sword arts and sword manuals in the empty ring. How many immortal stones will it cost? Chu Fengmian looked at all the sword arts and came back to his senses. He closed the empty ring and asked the first elder directly. Sect Master Chu needs all these sword arts? The first elder was surprised to hear Chu Fengmian's words. He thought Chu Fengmian just wanted to find a few rare sword arts to comprehend the sword Dao. He did not expect Chu Fengmian to buy all the sword arts in one go. A sword cultivator would cultivate at most 10 sword arts in his life. The more sword arts he cultivated, the more distracted he would be. Biting off more than one could chew was a fatal flaw, not only for sword cultivators, but also for any warrior. For example, some powerful warriors and demon gods only cultivated a few immortal martial arts and immortal art. It was impossible for them to comprehend a large number of immortal martial arts and immortal arts in one go. Biting off more than one could chew. The first elder brought so many sword arts and sword manuals for Chu Fengmian to choose from. The Sword Dao sect had been in the 9 regions for tens of thousands of years. The number of sword arts and sword manuals collected was astronomical. These sword arts and sword manuals were selected according to Chu Fengmian's wishes. They were rare, difficult to cultivate, and unique sword art. There were more than 10,000 of them. Chu Fengmian wanted to buy all of them in one go, which was beyond the first elder's expectations. However, the first elder had dealt with countless businesses. After a short moment of surprise, he quickly reacted and said to Chu Fengmian, "If you buy all of these sword arts, it will cost a total of 10,000 immortal stones." The value of these 10,000 plus sword techniques varied. Some sword techniques were of extremely high quality, and they were worth a few tens of immortal stones or even over 100 immortal stones. On the other hand, some sword techniques were of low quality and were difficult to cultivate, so they couldn't be sold for a good price at all. On average, it was about 1 immortal stone for 1 sword art. "Alright, I'll buy all of them." Chu Fengmian didn't bargain with the great elder. The items he sold were worth a total of 45,000 immortal stones. Even if he used these sword arts, Chu Fengmian could still get 35,000 immortal stones. Actually, these sword techniques might not be worth 10,000 immortal stones to other sword cultivators because there was utterly no sword cultivator that would be willing to purchase so many sword techniques in one go and would only choose a few amongst them. However, for Chu Fengmian, if he could comprehend all of the 10,000 sword principles and integrate them into the 9 regions sword principle, the increase in his strength would definitely be much greater than the increase in his strength by swallowing and refining the 10,000 immortal stones. Especially now, there was only 1 day left before Chu Fengmian went to the ruins of the Shang sword sect to compete for the inheritance. Within this day, Chu Fengmian had to improve his strength as much as possible. These 10,000 swordsmanship manuals were exactly what Chu Fengmian needed. Therefore, Chu Fengmian did not bargain and simply bought them all. Sect Master Chu is forthright. Seeing Chu Fengmian agree so readily, the great elder exclaimed in surprise. A transaction of 10,000 immortal stones was extremely rare in the sky-piercing pavilion. At the very least, the elders of the sky-piercing pavilion had to be present to finalize such a transaction. Furthermore, a transaction of this level would normally require several days of discussion, or even longer. It was indeed extremely rare for someone to agree so readily like Chu Fengmian. This is the sky-piercing pavilion's sky golden token. In the future, Sect Master Chu will be an esteemed guest of the sky-piercing pavilion. As long as you wish to make a transaction with the sky-piercing pavilion, the elders of the sky-piercing pavilion will come and make the transaction with you. The great elder took out a golden token and handed it to Chu Fengmian. The 2 words sky-piercing were engraved on the token. The 2 words were extremely charming and emitted a ray of light that shot straight to the 9 heavens, as if it really had the power to reach the heavens. Those 2 words had definitely been written by an extremely powerful existence. Chu Fengmian could even sense the aura of the expert who had written those 2 words back then. The aura of the profound heaven realm. The person who wrote the 2 words on the token must be an immortal marquis at the very least. Chu Fengmian exclaimed in his heart. The spiritual power of the two words, heaven-piercing, on the token hadn't dissipated yet. This proved that this token had been refined recently. It wasn't something that had been left behind from ancient times. The person who wrote the two words was definitely a profound heaven realm expert. At the very least, their strength was far above the great elders. The sky-piercing pavilion actually has such an expert? They actually have a profound heaven realm expert? Chu Fengmian was astonished. When he first met the great elder, he thought that the great elder was already one of the strongest people in the sky-piercing pavilion. But now, it seemed that there was always a sky beyond the sky and a person stronger than the great elder in the sky-piercing pavilion. The foundation of the sky-piercing pavilion was indeed not inferior to the 7 great sections. Chu Fengmian had to be incomparably cautious. Many thanks, great elder. Chu Fengmian didn't stand on ceremony and accepted the golden token. Since the sky-piercing pavilion had such a foundation and the great elder had personally come today with the intention of befriending Chu Fengmian, Chu Fengmian also went with the flow and befriended the sky-piercing pavilion. The major factions of the 9 regions and the 7 great sects were definitely Chu Fengmian's mortal enemies. Chu Fengmian and the 7 great sects would fight sooner or later, but because of the upheaval in the 9 regions and the arrival of countless experts from outer space, the battle had been delayed. But in the near future, Chu Fengmian would definitely fight the 7 great sections. Moreover, Chu Fengmian also wanted to rope in the various factions. He was willing to become the Dragon Lord of the Blue Dragon sect because he wanted to rope in the Blue Dragon sect. However, compared to the 7 great sects, a faction like the Blue Dragon sect was still too small. Whether it was strength or foundation, it was far inferior. However, the sky-piercing pavilion was different. The foundation of the sky-piercing pavilion was definitely not inferior to any of the 7 great sections. If Chu Fengmian could rope in the sky-piercing pavilion, it would be much easier for him to deal with the 7 great sections. Of course, Chu Fengmian also knew that a faction like the sky-piercing pavilion wouldn't be easy to rope in. The sky-piercing pavilion was even older than the 7 great sects and had always maintained a neutral position. That was why the sky-piercing pavilion had always been able to survive and prosper in the 9 regions. End of chapter. Chapter 2157. It was extremely difficult to rope in the sky-reaching pavilion, but by befriending them, Chu Fengmian could also ask them for help in the future. After all, the sky-reaching pavilion had always done things for profit. If Chu Fengmian could afford it, the sky-reaching pavilion could also do things for him. Now that he was on good terms with the sky-reaching pavilion, there was nothing to gain, so he immediately took the token. In my opinion, Sect Master Chu needs so many immortal stones because you want to use them to enter the celestial realm. Seeing Chu Fengmian take the token, the first elder looked at Chu Fengmian and suddenly said, "Yes, I need a lot of immortal power to enter the celestial realm. If the sky-reaching pavilion has a lot of immortal stones, I'm willing to exchange a lot of treasures." Chu Fengmian didn't hide and said directly. Almost any celestial realm expert could see that Chu Fengmian needed so much immortal stones. Chu Fengmian definitely wanted to step into the celestial realm, which was why he needed so many immortal stones. If these 35,000 immortal stones were given to an ordinary half-step celestial realm expert, they would probably be able to break through 100 times, but for Chu Fengmian, it was still a drop in the bucket. The immortal power Chu Fengmian needed was at least more than 1,000,000 immortal stones. Even though Chu Fengmian had killed and devoured the blood essence of the 3 immortal generals, Tianqing Jiandi, Black and White Lords, he still needed at least 800,000 to 900,000 immortal stones to accumulate enough strength to break through to the celestial realm. The great tribulation of the celestial realm was extremely dangerous for Chu Fengmian. As a mutant of heaven and earth, he was not tolerated by heaven and earth. Once he went to transcend the great tribulation of the celestial realm, he would definitely be blocked by the heavenly Tao. Therefore, Chu Fengmian had to accumulate strength to the limit and have complete confidence before he chose to transcend the great tribulation of the celestial realm. If Chu Fengmian wanted to transcend the great tribulation of the celestial realm, it was thousands or tens of thousands of times more difficult than ordinary martial artists or demon gods. In addition, Chu Fengmian was still far away from the great tribulation of the celestial realm. Therefore, Chu Fengmian's heart stirred when he heard the first elder's words. If Sky-Reaching Pavilion really did have a large amount of immortal stones, then Chu Fengmian could use a large amount of treasures to exchange for them. For example, Chu Fengmian still had the Seven Knights' sword, an immortal weapon, countless ancient sacred pills, and even the Life Grand Seal. They were all priceless treasures that Chu Fengmian could exchange for a large number of immortal stones. However, even the most famous merchant guilds might not be able to take out so many immortal stones. The number of immortal stones Chu Fengmian needed was simply an astronomical figure. Stepping into the celestial realm was a crucial step for Chu Fengmian. No matter how difficult it was, Chu Fengmian had to accumulate strength and attack the celestial tribulation. Chu Fengmian had obtained countless opportunities in the past, and what he was showing now was just a drop in the ocean. Only when Chu Fengmian stepped into the celestial realm would all of this truly erupt. At that time, Chu Fengmian's strength would have soared more than 100 times. Only by stepping into the celestial realm would Chu Fengmian be considered a true powerhouse, and he would have truly taken revenge on the 7 great sections. The foundation of the Sky-Reaching Pavilion today was beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. He was also looking forward to whether he could buy a large number of immortal stones from the Sky-Reaching Pavilion. Even if he couldn't accumulate enough to directly attack the celestial tribulation, a large number of immortal stones could still improve his strength. However, the first elder's answer disappointed Chu Fengmian. Our Sky-Reaching Pavilion can't take out a large number of immortal stones. Although many treasures have appeared after the upheaval of the 9 regions, immortal stones are a hard currency. Almost all of them are in the hands of celestial realm experts. There are not many who are willing to sell to us. The first elder shook his head and said, "For celestial realm martial artists and Yao gods, immortal stones were hard currency and also what they needed the most. Even though the Sky-Reaching Pavilion had been purchasing immortal stones in large quantities in the 9 regions, they didn't buy much. This time, they directly sold 35,000 immortal stones to Chu Fengmian, sweeping away all the immortal stones that the Sky-Reaching Pavilion had accumulated. However, our Sky-Reaching Pavilion has suddenly received several immortal pills in the past 2 days. I wonder if you're interested, Sect Master Chu?" Just as Chu Fengmian was feeling a little disappointed, the first elder suddenly changed the topic. "Immortal pills? Are they really immortal pills?" Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed as he looked at the first elder. There was some disbelief in his voice. Immortal pills were pills refined from immortal herbs, and their medicinal efficacy was countless times stronger than that of ancient sacred pills. Moreover, the energy contained in immortal pills was pure immortal energy. Ordinary immortal pills weren't something that even celestial realm martial artists were qualified to enjoy. Only profound heaven realm experts were truly qualified to enjoy immortal pills. The price of an immortal pill was no less than that of an immortal weapon. In this era, even immortal herbs were extremely rare, let alone immortal pills refined from immortal herbs. Now that the first elder said that the Sky-Reaching Pavilion had immortal pills, Chu Fengmian was a little skeptical. However, Chu Fengmian also knew that the first elder wasn't someone who would speak without thinking. Chu Fengmian continued to ask, "What kind of immortal pill is it? What's the price?" Immortal pills were pills refined from immortal herbs. They contained incomparably pure immortal energy. No matter what kind of immortal pill it was, even if it was used for healing, The immortal energy contained within would be extremely useful for increasing Chu Fengmian's strength. If the sky-reaching pavilion really did have immortal pills, then Chu Fengmian would buy them no matter how high the price was. This immortal pill is called the Huaqing Immortal Pill. It's a type of immortal pill used for cultivation. The price of each pill is 1,000 immortal stones. The first elder raised his hand and a jade bottle appeared in his palm. It contained the azure-colored pill. Huaqing Immortal Pill? 1,000 immortal stones for one pill? Chu Fengmian was extremely shocked when he heard the first elder's words. He wasn't shocked by the immortal pill, but by the price. The price of an immortal pill wasn't inferior to an ordinary immortal weapon. If converted to spirit stones, it would be worth at least several thousand spirit stones, or even 10,000 spirit stones. Yet, the price that the first elder said was only 1,000 immortal stones. It was merely a tenth of the price of an ordinary immortal pill. Even an immortal pill that had lost a large amount of its medicinal strength and only had 30 to 40% of its medicinal strength left wouldn't be able to sell for such a price. However, Chu Fengmian's gaze suddenly turned to the jade bottle. The azure-colored immortal pill contained within the jade bottle had a cyan luster on its surface that caused Chu Fengmian to feel somewhat uncomfortable. It was as if the cyan luster was something that was added to the immortal pill, and not the original color of the Huaqing Immortal Pill. "Could you open the jade bottle and have a look?" Chu Fengmian looked to the first elder and asked. The jade bottle isolated his immortal energy. Thus, Chu Fengmian was unable to determine the origin of the immortal pill and whether it was real or fake. Chapter 2158. Furthermore, Chu Fengmian instinctively felt that there was something strange about the immortal pellet. "Sect Master Chu, please be careful." Hearing Chu Fengmian's warning, the great elder carefully opened the jade bottle. Immediately, a cyan blue miasma was emitted from the bottle. This caused Chu Fengmian to frown. The cyan blue miasma was enveloped by the great elder's spiritual power, preventing it from being emitted. However, Chu Fengmian was able to clearly sense that the cyan blue miasma was an extremely poisonous gas. After opening the jade bottle, Chu Fengmian was able to clearly see that the immortal pellet was covered with countless amounts of extremely poisonous gas. That was the reason why the immortal pellet had such a cyan blue color. "Great Elder, could this immortal pellet be a poisonous pellet?" Chu Fengmian asked with an ice-cold expression. The immortal pellet simply did not resemble an immortal pellet at all. It was simply a poisonous pellet. The extremely poisonous gas on the immortal pellet was so strong that even Chu Fengmian felt a sense of danger. It was no wonder the great elder was able to offer such a cheap price. The Huaqing Immortal Pellet was covered with extremely poisonous gas. It could be said that if one were to come into contact with the Huaqing Immortal Pellet in the slightest, one would be met with a calamity. Unless one were to completely neutralize all of the poison on the Huaqing Immortal Pellet, no one would dare to ingest and refine it. It was also no wonder that the Sky Span Pavilion would sell all of their immortal pellet. To the Sky Span Pavilion, the Huaqing Immortal Pellet was simply a hot potato. Although they knew that it was an actual immortal pellet, they were simply unable to ingest it. They could only look at it. This was especially true for the extremely poisonous gas within the Huaqing Immortal Pellet. Even immortal general-level experts would be incomparably fatal. When the great elder took out the Huaqing Immortal Pellet, he enveloped it with his spiritual power so that the Huaqing Immortal Pellet would not emit even the slightest bit of poison. "Sect Master Chu, you must be joking. This Huaqing Immortal Pellet is indeed an actual immortal pellet. Furthermore, after being appraised by our Sky Span Pavilion, we have determined that the medicinal energy contained within this Huaqing Immortal Pellet has not been damaged in the slightest. Its medicinal energy contained within its medicinal energy." The great elder was able to hear the ridicule in Chu Fengmian's words. "I also know that the poison on the Huaqing Immortal Pill is extremely difficult to deal with. The true value of the Huaqing immortal pill is at least 10,000 immortal stones in exchange for one Huaqing immortal pill. However, our sky-reaching pavilion has no way to neutralize the poison in the Huaqing immortal pill. That's why we're selling it at such a low price. At this point, the great elder's voice suddenly stopped, and he spoke again. Others do not possess the means to neutralize the Huaqing immortal pellet's poison. However, for Sect Master Chu, who possesses the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast, it should not be impossible for him to do so. This time, it was Chu Fengmian's turn to be shocked. The great elder had actually pointed out the existence of the heaven-devouring beast bloodline in Chu Fengmian's body. Although Chu Fengmian did not deliberately hide his heaven-devouring bloodline when he fought, there were very few experts who truly recognized the heaven-devouring beast. The first elder had actually pointed out Chu Fengmian's heaven-devouring beast bloodline. In that case, he had indeed come prepared. That said, it was indeed as the great elder had said. While it was true that others would not be able to neutralize the Huaqing immortal pill's poison, Chu Fengmian was different. He possessed the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast, and possessed the power to devour the heavens. Although the Huaqing immortal pill's poison was very powerful, it was not impossible for Chu Fengmian to completely neutralize and devour it. Furthermore, the Huaqing immortal pill contained 100% of its medicinal energy. This proved that the medicinal energy of the Huaqing immortal pill had not diminished in the slightest over the years. Such an immortal pill was much more effective than the immortal pills that had lost their medicinal energy. The Sky-Reaching Pavilion's information network is very powerful. You know quite a lot, Chu Fengmian said calmly. Chu Fengmian said calmly. It was hard to tell whether his tone was sarcasm or praise. Apart from trading treasures, our Sky-Reaching Pavilion is also engaged in the information business. If Sect Master Chu requires any information, you can come and find us. Our Sky-Reaching Pavilion will always welcome an esteemed guest like Sect Master Chu. The great elder said with a smile. Our Sky-Reaching Pavilion has a total of 7 Huaqing immortal pills. If Sect Master Chu needs them, our Sky-Reaching Pavilion is willing to sell all 7 to Sect Master Chu. 7 Huaqing immortal pills, a total of 5,000 immortal stones. I'll take them at that price. Chu Fengmian thought for a moment and said coldly. Although the Huaqing immortal pill's poison was very powerful, Chu Fengmian could slowly neutralize it with his heaven-devouring power. However, 1,000 immortal stones for a single Huaqing immortal pill was a little too expensive. The Huaqing immortal pill was indeed somewhat useful in Chu Fengmian's hands. However, if it was in the hands of any other cultivator or Yao immortal, or even a profound heaven realm expert, it would be no different from trash. If the poison on the Huaqing immortal pill wasn't completely neutralized, it would be no different from courting death if it was devoured rashly. It could be said that other than Chu Fengmian, it was impossible for the Sky-Reaching Pavilion to sell the Huaqing immortal pill. Although Chu Fengmian had a lot of immortal stones in his possession, he had accumulated them bit by bit. Naturally, he would not be a fool. A total of 5,000 immortal stones and 7 Huaqing immortal pills was Chu Fengmian's bottom line. Sect Master Chu, the Huaqing immortal pill is an immortal pill with full medicinal strength. Hearing Chu Fengmian's words, the first elder said with a frown. He naturally knew that the Huaqing immortal pill was of little value. Although it was extremely valuable and truly an immortal pill with full medicinal strength, it was impossible to consume due to the poison on it. One could only look at it. The Sky-Reaching Pavilion had only obtained the 7 Huaqing immortal pills by chance. The various experts of the Sky-Reaching Pavilion had used countless methods to neutralize the poison on the Huaqing immortal pills, but to no avail. In the end, they could only choose to give up and sell them. Although Chu Fengmian's price was not much, it was still a total of 2,000 immortal stones. One must know that 2,000 immortal stones was a huge transaction even for the sky-reaching pavilion. Chu Fengmian's price had put him in a dilemma. These Huaqing immortal pills are contaminated with poison. They are already trash. Even though I possess the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast, it will be extremely difficult to refine them. 5,000 immortal stones is my bottom line. Chu Fengmian stared at the first elder and said resolutely, "Apart from me, no one else will be willing to purchase these Huaqing immortal pills. To the sky-reaching pavilion, 5,000 immortal stones is already a windfall that came out of nowhere." Hearing Chu Fengmian's words, the first elder felt extremely helpless. He also knew that he had to accept Chu Fengmian's price. It was as Chu Fengmian had said. If Chu Fengmian did not purchase the Huaqing immortal pills, there would not be anyone in the entire 9 regions who would purchase them. End of chapter. Chapter 2159. 5,000 Immortal Stones. The first elder finally said after some thought. Not only was the Huaqing immortal pill useless in the hands of the sky-reaching pavilion, but it was also a bomb that could explode at any time. If the toxic miasma attached to the Huaqing immortal pill were to be released, it would be a disaster for the Pavilion of Transcendence. There was once a celestial realm expert in the Pavilion of Transcendence who died because he accidentally came into contact with the miasma. If he sold the Huaqing immortal pill to Chu Fengmian, he could get 5,000 immortal stones and get rid of a big problem. As the first elder spoke, he took out a few more jade bottles. Each Huaqing immortal pill was placed in a separate jade bottle. There were a total of 7 jade bottles, and he handed them to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian received it carefully. He had set up several arrays on the jade bottle to prevent the toxic miasma from leaking out of it. Once the toxic miasma leaked out, it would be a disaster for the Sword Dao sect. After doing all this, Chu Fengmian carefully put the 7 jade bottles into the deepest part of his spatial ring. Here are 30,000 immortal stones. The first elder moved his hand and another spatial ring appeared in his palm. He handed it to Chu Fengmian. The treasures Chu Fengmian sold to the sky-reaching pavilion were worth a total of 45,000 immortal stones. After deducting 10,000 immortal stones to buy the sword manual and 5,000 immortal stones to buy the Huaqing immortal pill, he had 30,000 immortal stones left. Chu Fengmian took the spatial ring and probed it with his spiritual sense. There were 30,000 immortal stones in total, no more, no less. After confirming it, Chu Fengmian transferred all the immortal stones into his spatial ring. The transaction is complete. Sect Master Chu, we won't stay here any longer. If you still want to do business with the sky-reaching pavilion in the future, you can summon us with your token. The first elder glanced at Chu Fengmian, then left with Su Qi. After the two from the sky-reaching pavilion left, Chu Fengmian's figure disappeared from Cloud Feather Palace. He went to the deepest part of the Sword Origin world, the Sword Sovereign Palace. After obtaining the 7 Huaqing immortal pills, Chu Fengmian immediately tried to refine them. There was only 1 day left before the opening of the Shangjian sect's ruins. With Chu Fengmian's escape light, he would only need to depart half a day earlier even if he headed to the vicinity of the Shangjian sect's ruins in advance. For Chu Fengmian, there was still half a day to increase his strength. The stronger Chu Fengmian was, the more likely he would be to fight for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. In the past few days, the 9 regions had been plunged into a bloodbath. It was unknown how many Celestial Realm elites had fallen because of the Upper Sword Execution Order portrait. In order to obtain the Upper Sword Executor's token portrait, countless experts from the Outer Realms, the 9 realms, and even the 3 great sacred realms had taken action. Chu Fengmian could feel that a few of the sword execution diagrams had changed owners. Clearly, those who had obtained the Upper Sword Enforcer token portrait had been killed by other experts, and the Upper Sword Enforcer token portrait had been obtained by others. Chu Fengmian wasn't surprised. The weak were prey to the strong, and the strong were revered. This principle was the principle of the entire world. The Upper Sword sect had released the Upper Sword Execution Order portrait since ancient times to allow countless experts to kill each other. Only the truly strongest were qualified to obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. Chu Fengmian had established his prestige after subduing Forefather Holy Spring and killing the black-white young lords. Therefore, he had a lot of free time these past few days. However, Chu Fengmian knew that this was only temporary. As long as Chu Fengmian remained in the Origin Sword world, none of the Yao gods wanted to attack him. After all, the origin energy of the Origin Sword world wasn't something that ordinary immortal generals could contend against. However, if Chu Fengmian wanted to fight for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect, he would definitely have to leave the Origin Sword world. When that happened, others would have the opportunity to make a move. Once Chu Fengmian left the Origin Sword world, he would no longer be able to use the origin energy of the Origin Sword world. It would be equivalent to severing one of his arms. Outside the Origin Sword world, Chu Fengmian could clearly sense that there were still some Yao gods eyeing the Upper Sword Execution Order portrait in his hands. The moment Chu Fengmian left the Origin Sword world, they would make a move to snatch it. However, Chu Fengmian wasn't worried. The strength he had displayed previously wasn't his full strength. Chu Fengmian was still hiding his strength. If anyone dared to try and snatch the Upper Sword Execution Order portrait, they would be courting death. Chu Fengmian observed the situation outside the Origin Sword world while releasing a Huaqing Immortal Pill from the jade bottle. The Huaqing Immortal Pill was enveloped by Chu Fengmian's spiritual energy, preventing the poison within from spreading. The poison within this Huaqing Immortal Pill is unheard of. It's most likely an extremely ancient poison. Chu Fengmian carefully observed the Huaqing Immortal Pill, but he couldn't determine what kind of poison it was. Generally speaking, the first step to detoxifying a poison was to understand what kind of poison it was. Only then could one make the right choice. However, that was only for ordinary people. For Chu Fengmian, who controlled the heaven-devouring origin, he could directly devour any kind of poison with his heaven-devouring origin. Chu Fengmian only took a few glances before he immediately operated the sky-devouring secret skill. It turned into a whirlpool and appeared above Chu Fengmian's head. The Huaqing Immortal Pill was immediately sucked into the whirlpool. Wisps of poison were extracted from the Huaqing Immortal Pill and devoured bit by the heaven-devouring secret technique. It can indeed be neutralized. Chu Fengmian's face lit up with joy when he saw the poison on the Huaqing Immortal Pill being neutralized bit by bit. Chu Fengmian was only guessing whether the heaven-devouring secret technique could neutralize the poison on the Huaqing Immortal Pill. After all, this was the first time Chu Fengmian used the Huaqing Immortal Pill to neutralize poison. Now, it seemed that the heaven-devouring secret technique was indeed worthy of its name of devouring the heavens. The poison on the Huaqing Immortal Pill that was strong enough to kill an immortal general was being slowly devoured by the heaven-devouring secret technique. However, the Huaqing Immortal Pill had been contaminated with poison for a long time. It had been at least tens of thousands of years. Much of the insides of the immortal pill had been corroded by the poison. Neutralizing all the poison was not something that could be done in an instant. Even the heaven-devouring secret technique could only slowly neutralize the poison on the Huaqing Immortal Pill. Since the poison could be neutralized, Chu Fengmian wasn't in a hurry. He simply took out the other 6 Huaqing Immortal Pills and threw them into the heaven-devouring secret technique. He let the heaven-devouring secret technique slowly neutralize the poisonous miasma on the Huaqing Immortal Pill. On the other side, Chu Fengmian sat on the ground and took out a sword manual. End of chapter. Chapter 2160. Under Chu Fengmian's control, tens of thousands of swordsmanship manuals flew out of the empty ring and surrounded Chu Fengmian. Many swordsmanship manuals emitted sharp sword intent. Many of these swordsmanship manuals were extremely ancient. Chu Fengmian had only heard of the names of some of them in ancient books. Such ancient swordsmanship manuals were actually kept in the sky-reaching pavilion's inventory. These swordsmanship manuals were extremely obscure and difficult to understand. For ordinary sword cultivators, not only were there no benefits to cultivating these swordsmanship manuals, but there was also the risk of chi deviation. Some of these swordsmanship manuals could be said to be created by some sword maniac. In front of Chu Fengmian, among the tens of thousands of swordsmanship manuals, there was a scroll that was shaped like a beast skin. The sword intent emitted was the most powerful, and there was a hint of madness on the sword intent. Chu Fengmian glanced at it and saw the word Mad Demon written on the sword intent. This swordsmanship was called the Mad Demon swordsmanship. This swordsmanship was created by a sword genius in the 9 regions 100,000 years ago, the Mad Demon swordsmanship. It was said that the Mad Demon swordsmanship was a sword genius, but he was born mad. Such a person could not cultivate. However, the Mad Demon swordsmanship was extremely high, and he actually created a swordsmanship that belonged to him. It was the Mad Demon swordsmanship. Although the Mad Demon swordsmanship was a heaven-class martial technique, its power in the hands of the Mad Demon swordsmanship was stronger than many immortal techniques. This also led to many sword cultivators wanting to cultivate the Mad Demon swordsmanship in that era, but in the end, none of them succeeded. The Mad Demon swordsmanship was created by the Mad Demon swordsmanship. It was created by the madness in his heart. Once a sword cultivator wanted to cultivate the Mad Demon swordsmanship, they would be infected by the madness in the Mad Demon swordsmanship. If it was light, they would suffer chi deviation and be injured. If it was serious, they would become a lunatic like the Mad Demon swordsmanship. After countless sword cultivators fell to the Mad Demon swordsmanship, no one in the world dared to cultivate it. No matter how powerful the Mad Demon swordsmanship was, once one cultivated it, they would become a lunatic. In this era, no sword cultivator dared to accept it. The Mad Demon's sword art fell silent. With no one cultivating it, it was naturally difficult to pass it down. Chu Fengmian had chanced upon this Mad Demon sword technique in an ancient book. However, that ancient book had been written by a sword cultivator 30,000 years ago. In the ancient books there were only a few mentions of the Mad Demon sword art. In that era, the Mad Demon sword art was almost lost. None of the sword cultivators who wrote the ancient book had actually seen the Mad Demon sword art. They had only heard of it from others and wrote it down in the ancient book. When Chu Fengmian saw the Mad Demon swordsmanship, he was surprised. It wasn't just the Mad Demon swordsmanship. There were also many ancient swordsmanship that had been lost. They were all in the Pavilion of Transcendence. Chu Fengmian had obtained far more swordsmanship from the deal with Sky-reaching Pavilion than he had imagined. In terms of power, the Mad Demon sword art was definitely not inferior to an immortal technique. Moreover, this was a swordsmanship created by the Mad Demon sword when he was only in the Emperor realm. Once the Mad Demon sword reached the half-step celestial realm or even the celestial realm, the Mad Demon sword art would definitely have the capital to become an immortal technique. It would even be one of the most powerful swordsmanship among the thousands of immortal techniques. Unfortunately, the Mad Swordsmanship Demon was a lunatic, who had offended countless enemies. In the end, he was slain by a few sects during that era, resulting in his death. Otherwise, the achievements of the Mad Demon sword art and the Mad Demon sword art would definitely be more than that. The Mad Demon sword was actually crazy in his heart. However, he had no distractions in his heart. The Mad Demon sword art that he created is indeed very powerful. It seems violent, but there is order in chaos. It could only contain the madness of the Mad Demon sword art, which made it impossible for ordinary people to cultivate it. Chu Fengmian opened the beast's skin and saw the insane demon's swordsmanship recorded on it. Although it was only a few images, Chu Fengmian could clearly see the power of the insane demon's swordsmanship from these few images. There are many comprehensions in the mad demon's sword art that I have never heard of. It is just right to integrate them into the 9 regions sword art to perfect it. Chu Fengmian was comprehending the mad demon's sword art. Suddenly, the ancient book of sword principles appeared in front of him. A brand new page of swordsmanship was condensing. Chu Fengmian's aura became frantic. His eyes turned blood-red as if he was possessed by the devil. This was the effect of the mad demon's sword art. When the mad sword demon created the mad demon swordsmanship, he also fused the madness in his heart into it. Anyone who wanted to comprehend the mad demon swordsmanship would be affected by the madness in his heart. Chu Fengmian was no exception. However, even though Chu Fengmian's aura was incomparably crazy, his heart was incomparably calm. To become a powerhouse, he naturally had an invincible Tao heart. Even if he was crazy, it could not affect Chu Fengmian. Done. In the ancient book of sword principles, a brand new page was condensed. The comprehensions of the mad demon sword art were all integrated into the ancient book of sword principles by Chu Fengmian. At the same time, Chu Fengmian let out a long roar. The madness on his body gradually disappeared. It was completely suppressed. As the mad demon sword art was integrated, Chu Fengmian felt that the aura on his body became more tyrannical. Although the mad demon sword art was only a heaven-grade sword art, the profoundness in it was more powerful than an immortal art. Some of the ideas were beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. The mad demon sword art was worthy of being called a genius of sword principles. Chu Fengmian even felt that his comprehension of sword principles was not inferior to Chu Fengmian's. If he really grew up, it was possible for him to become an immortal emperor. Unfortunately, the mad demon sword art was born a lunatic. He was extremely excited to be able to embark on the path of cultivation, but in the end, he still ended up dying. After comprehending the mad demon sword art, Chu Fengmian grabbed the next book of swordsmanship and began to comprehend it. There were tens of thousands of swordsmanship here. Chu Fengmian wanted to integrate all of them into the next book of swordsmanship. Time passed by minute. Chu Fengmian had been staying in the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace. Above his head, within the vortex formed by the heaven-devouring secret technique, the 7 Huaqing immortal pills were slowly being neutralized by the heaven-devouring power. The poison on the pills was mostly neutralized, revealing a crystalline and transparent color. Chapter 2161. Time ticked by. By the time Chu Fengmian had comprehended all 10,000 sword techniques and integrated them into the ancient book, he realized that half a day had already passed. Only someone with Chu Fengmian's understanding of sword principles could comprehend 10,000 sword techniques and sword manuals in half a day. Chu Fengmian's understanding of sword principles was already close to the origin of sword principles. Chu Fengmian had vaguely touched the origin of sword principles among the incomplete sword techniques in the sword principle totem. However, the sword techniques were incomplete, so Chu Fengmian couldn't really step into the origin of sword principles. However, when it came to sword comprehension, even the invincible sword cultivators in history might not necessarily have a better understanding of the sword than Chu Fengmian. For an ordinary sword cultivator, it would take at least a few years for them to comprehend all of the 10,000 sword techniques and sword manuals. However, Chu Fengmian managed to do it in just half a day. Chu Fengmian didn't just comprehend the 10,000 swordsmanship manuals. He also integrated the comprehensions into the ancient swordsmanship manual. Hundreds of new pages were condensed in the ancient swordsmanship manual. Now, the ancient book of sword principles was already a sword manual in front of Chu Fengmian. Even if it was passed down like this, it would become an immortal work of sword principles in the future. However, Chu Fengmian's goal wasn't limited to that. He wanted to integrate all the swordsmanship in the world into the ancient swordsmanship book. At the same time, Chu Fengmian wanted to make the nine-domain swordsmanship the best swordsmanship in the world. Now this was far from enough. Very good. My current strength has increased by at least 30%. In this way, even if I face an immortal marquee expert, I still have the ability to fight. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but smile when he felt the power in his body. In fact, Chu Fengmian's realm had reached a bottleneck. Even in history, among the countless geniuses in the history, it was extremely shocking to have such strength in the half-step celestial realm. Logically speaking, it would be extremely difficult for Chu Fengmian to improve his strength further. However, this time, Chu Fengmian's strength increased by 30% after the integration of tens of thousands of swordsmanship manuals. This also exceeded Chu Fengmian's previous expectations. However, this was also because these tens of thousands of swordsmanship manuals were extremely unfamiliar to Chu Fengmian. Moreover, there was no lack of extremely powerful and unique swordsmanship like the crazy demon swordsmanship. Therefore, these 10,000 sword techniques and sword manuals improved the ancient sword Dao book. If it were an ordinary sword technique or sword manual, even 100,000 might not be comparable to these 10,000 sword manuals. Moreover, this time, Chu Fengmian had bought all the swordsmanship manuals that had been accumulated in Sky-Reaching Pavilion for tens of thousands of years. There would not be a second opportunity like this. The Sky-Reaching Pavilion was the largest chamber of commerce in the 9 regions. It could be said that Chu Fengmian had incorporated most of the sword techniques that were circulating in the 9 regions into the ancient swordsmanship book. It could be said that it would be almost impossible for Chu Fengmian to make any further progress in this ancient book of sword principles. Unless Chu Fengmian had some amazing fortuitous encounter, there would be no chance for him to advance by leaps and bounds. However, speaking of fortuitous encounters, now there was a great opportunity in front of Chu Fengmian. It was the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. As the oldest Sword Dao sect, there was no doubt that the Upper Sword sect was powerful. In the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect, the most powerful unparalleled sword technique was also one of the top 10 ancient immortal techniques. Moreover, the unparalleled sword technique was not the only sword technique in the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. The sword techniques of the Upper Sword sect were the so-called blooming of hundreds of flowers. Today, the 9 domains, and even the entire extraterritorial starry sky, the 3 great holy realms, and countless sword Dao sects had inherited the Upper Sword sect's swordsmanship. Chu Fengmian couldn't imagine how many swordsmanship the Upper Sword sect had inherited. However, Chu Fengmian knew that if he obtained the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect, it would definitely be enough to make his strength soar again and even help him break through to the celestial realm. This time, Chu Fengmian was determined to obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect when the ruins of the Upper Sword sect opened. However, Chu Fengmian was not the only sword cultivator who had the Upper Sword Execution Order chart. There were a total of 12 sword cultivators. Without exception, these 12 people were all sword cultivators. Chu Fengmian had to be careful when dealing with them. This time, Chu Fengmian's strength had increased again. This made Chu Fengmian more confident in competing for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. It's time to go to the entrance of the Upper Sword sect ruins. Calculating the time, the Upper Sword sect's historical remains would be opened in half a day. Once the historical remains opened, whoever entered first would have the upper hand. Chu Fengmian naturally needed to arrive a little earlier and make preparations. What disappointed Chu Fengmian was that the 7 Huaqing immortal pills had not been completely detoxified by the heaven-devouring secret technique. Above his head, in the vortex formed by the heaven-devouring secret technique, the 7 Huaqing immortal pills were being slowly detoxified by the heaven-devouring power. The blue color of the poison was mostly detoxified, revealing a crystal-clear color. This crystal-clear color was the true color of the Huaqing immortal pills. However, there was still poison lingering on the Huaqing immortal pills. The poison had been lingering on the Huaqing immortal pill for at least several tens of thousands of years. Even with Chu Fengmian's heaven-devouring origin and his heaven-devouring force, he was unable to neutralize the poison within a short period of time. The 7 Huaqing immortal pills contained 100% of the energy of the pills. They were no different from the pills that had just come out of the cauldron. Chu Fengmian felt that once he devoured these 7 Huaqing immortal pills, it would bring him great benefit. It could further increase his strength. The stronger Chu Fengmian was, the greater his chances of competing for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. However, it seemed that it was too late now. It seemed that the Huaqing immortal pills still needed half a day to be completely detoxified by the heaven-devouring secret technique. At that time, Chu Fengmian should have already entered the Upper Sword sect ruins. However, in these few days, Chu Fengmian also looked up some records regarding the Upper Sword sect inheritance. The competition for the Upper Sword sect inheritance was not a short period of time. It would last at least a week. During this week, there would be various tests for the Upper Sword sect. At the same time, he would have to face the sneak attacks of other competitors. Only after all the tests were over, he would be able to determine the true successor of the Upper Sword sect inheritance. After entering the Upper Sword sect ruins, Chu Fengmian could still find an opportunity to devour the Huaqing immortal pills. He was not in a hurry now. Chapter 2162. Chu Fengmian left the Sword Emperor Palace and appeared in the Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace. He said a few words to Han Yueli, Luo Shi, Mad Dragon Emperor, and the others before he set off towards the Upper Sword sect ruins. The specific location of the Upper Sword sect ruins was not recorded in detail in the countless ancient books that Chu Fengmian had read. All the records said that the Upper Sword sect was located in a small world. This small world was hidden in the depths of the 9 regions. If one did not know the specific spatial coordinates, it was almost impossible to find it by wandering around. Moreover, there was even a possibility of getting lost in the depths of the void. If one was unlucky, one might be trapped in the depths of the void and die. The void space of the 9 regions was also stacked with countless layers. Even cultivators at the Divine Force realm could easily pass through the void space at the edges. However, the closer one was to the core of the void, the more powerful the spatial laws were. The spatial storms it contained were even more powerful. An Emperor Realm cultivator or even a Celestial Realm cultivator might get lost in it and die. According to the Shangjian execution chart, the small world where the ruins of the Shangjian sect were located was the core of the depths of this void. There, even a Celestial Realm cultivator would be in danger of dying if he rashly entered it. Chu Fengmian passed through countless voids and finally stepped into the core area. It was pitch black here. He could not even see his fingers if he stretched out his hand. All he could see was darkness. In such a place, it was very likely that one would get lost. Even a Celestial Realm cultivator was no exception. Normally, even Chu Fengmian, who had the bloodline of the primogenitor Tianlong and a comprehension of the Tao of space, did not dare to rashly enter such a place. However, this time, Chu Fengmian had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token. The Upper Sword Execution Token recorded the coordinates of the Upper Sword sect ruins. Therefore, Chu Fengmian would not get lost in the core area of the void. However, the danger in the core area of the void was not as simple as getting lost. Suddenly, a violent spatial force erupted from Chu Fengmian's side. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed as he saw an incomparably huge figure in the depths of the pitch-black void. This figure was a gigantic beast that was at least 1,000 zhang long. This is a void beast. Chu Fengmian had never seen a void beast before. However, he had read in some ancient books that there was a type of void beast that lived in the depths of the void. These void behemoths were born naturally. They were the condensation of space energy. These void behemoths were extremely ferocious. Many void behemoths were born from the space energy of a small world after it was shattered. They possessed the power of that small world. According to ancient records, even immortal generals and profound heaven realm experts had died at the hands of the void beast. Chu Fengmian sensed that the void beast before him was at least at the immortal realm, or even the immortal warrior realm. Although it was not as terrifying as the ancient books that said it could kill immortal generals, it was definitely a ferocious beast. If it was placed in the 9 regions, it would cause a bloody storm. Who knew how many martial artists and demon gods would die in its mouth? However, this void beast was born in the depths of the void and would never leave the depths of the void. It only knew how to wander in the depths of the void and feed on the small worlds that floated in the depths of the void. Most small worlds would be fixed at a set of coordinates in the void of the 9 domains, so they wouldn't approach the depths of the void. However, due to various accidents, some small worlds would be attracted by the power of the void and pulled into the depths of the void. These small worlds would become the physical objects of the void beasts and even give birth to new void beasts. Void behemoths were life forms formed by the pure space energy. The older the void beast, the more space energy it could devour and the stronger it would be. The void beast in front of them was obviously very young. However, even a young void beast was much more powerful than an ordinary immortal realm martial artist. In the depths of the void, ordinary martial artists and demon gods would not be able to use their full strength. However, this void beast was born in the depths of the void and could move freely in the void like a fish in water. Although this void beast only had the strength of an immortal realm martial artist and demon gods, ordinary immortal warrior realm martial artists and demon gods were no match for it in the depths of the void. Roar! This void beast discovered Chu Fengmian, an outsider. It roared and opened its mouth to devour Chu Fengmian. This roar caused the entire void to tremble. It contained boundless space law. Chu Fengmian could sense that this void beast was a few miles away a moment ago. However, in an instant it was already in front of him. This void beast had a supreme comprehension of the space Tao. It could shrink the distance and instantly launch an attack in the depths of the void. It was impossible to guard against. Many martial artists and demon gods who entered the depths of the void for the first time died in the mouth of the void beast before they could react. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian had read a lot of ancient books and had some understanding of void beasts. The moment the void beast opened its mouth to devour Chu Fengmian made his move. The sword in his hand flickered as the ancestral dragon sword was unsheathed and slashed at the void beast. Chu Fengmian's sword landed on the face of the void behemoth. The head of the void behemoth was severed by the sword. However, the void behemoth didn't die. Instead, it suddenly split into 2 identical behemoths and rushed towards Chu Fengmian again. Void behemoths were creatures that were born from pure spatial power. They were almost impossible to kill unless they were broken up again and again until the spatial power within them dissipated. Otherwise, these void behemoths were almost immortal. Because of this, void beasts were the most difficult existences to deal with in the depths of the void. However, Chu Fengmian had his ways. Suddenly, Chu Fengmian's mind flickered. Above his head, 2 incomparably huge claws of the battle dragon descended with a loud rumble and grabbed the 2 bodies of the void behemoths abruptly. Chapter 2163. Under the suppression of the heaven-devouring power, the enormous void beast shrank rapidly. The space energy it contained condensed bit by bit under the heaven-devouring power and eventually turned into a fist-sized crystal. At a glance, the crystal contained an enormous amount of space energy. It was like a small world. This was the true appearance of a void beast. It was pure space energy. Is this the mysterious void crystal mentioned in the records? Chu Fengmian looked at the fist-sized crystal in his palm and carefully observed it. This kind of void beast was a living being born from the purest spatial power. The mysterious void crystal was a crystal that stored the purest spatial power within it. The mysterious void crystal was very beneficial to martialist demon gods. Directly devouring the mysterious void crystal would allow martialist demon gods to devour the space energy within it. This would allow their space Tao to advance further. This kind of mysterious void crystal could only be obtained by killing void beasts in the depths of the void. This was the first time Chu Fengmian had seen it with his own eyes. Previously, Chu Fengmian had only heard of the mysterious void crystal in some ancient records. It was said that in ancient times, some powerful martialist demon gods would deliberately come to the depths of the void to hunt void beasts and obtain the mysterious void crystal to increase their comprehension of the space Tao. The space Tao was one of the most powerful martial Taos. Moreover, most martial artists and demon gods cultivated the space Tao. If they did not cultivate the space Tao, they would not even be able to travel through space. In terms of the void ring Tao, a martial artist who had reached the large success stage was an enemy that many people didn't want to meet even in their dreams. When this Tao of space was cultivated to an extremely high level, it was extremely easy for them to shrink the ground and hide in space. A sudden attack would be impossible to guard against. Just like this void beast, it suddenly attacked and crossed the space in an instant. If Chu Fengmian didn't have some understanding of the void beasts from ancient books, he would have suffered a loss. Chu Fengmian's understanding of the Tao of space, coupled with the power of the primogenitor Tianlong's bloodline, surpassed that of martial artists and Yao gods of similar strength. This was also the reason why Chu Fengmian had been able to escape from danger countless times. Back in the Seashore sect, Chu Fengmian was able to escape from Seashore Emperor thanks to his spatial Tao. The stronger one's understanding of space, the stronger they would be. Chu Fengmian's space Tao was mainly based on the power of progenitor Tianlong's bloodline. His own understanding of the space Tao wasn't much. Since he was already in the depths of the void, he might as well use these void beasts to hone his space Tao. It's said that the power of the mysterious void crystal is very easy to swallow. Compared to ordinary pills, refining it is much easier. Chu Fengmian carefully observed the mysterious void crystal. With a move of his palm, he clenched the mysterious void crystal tightly. Immediately, a stream of extremely pure spatial power poured into Chu Fengmian's body. This stream of spatial power was extremely gentle. Chu Fengmian did not need to expend any effort to refine it. It directly integrated into Chu Fengmian's body, making him feel extremely comfortable. As the spatial power of the mysterious void crystal poured into Chu Fengmian's body, Chu Fengmian felt that his control of the surrounding space had increased. His control of the space Tao had improved. Let's go! Chu Fengmian's figure moved and suddenly traversed through the depths of the void. This time, he traversed 100 miles in the depths of the void. With Chu Fengmian's current strength, he could traverse 100 miles in the blink of an eye. However, Chu Fengmian still felt that his speed had increased. Although it was only a slight increase, Chu Fengmian's control of the space Tao had improved because he had devoured the mysterious void crystal. Even his speed had increased. This mysterious void crystal is really a precious treasure. It can directly improve one's comprehension of the space Tao. If I devour more, my flying light will become even faster. Chu Fengmian's eyes lit up with joy. His flying light was already much faster than ordinary immortal generals. If he devoured more mysterious void crystals, his flying light would become even faster. In the future, regardless of whether Chu Fengmian encountered danger, it would be extremely easy for him to escape or pursue. Moreover, the benefits of devouring the mysterious void crystal were not limited to just the speed of his flying light. There were many other benefits. Let's go and hunt more void beasts. After learning about the countless benefits of the mysterious void crystal, Chu Fengmian continued to fly in the direction of the Upper Sword Sect's ruins. This time, Chu Fengmian wasn't just waiting for the void beasts to attack him. He also fully activated his spiritual consciousness. As long as he encountered a void beast, he would take the initiative to attack and kill it. 2 hours passed. Chu Fengmian had killed a total of 7 void beasts. 6 of them were similar in strength to the one Chu Fengmian had killed earlier. Only the last void beast was at the immortal general level. Chu Fengmian had used almost all his strength to force the void beast into a desperate situation. However, the void beast still managed to escape again and again. In the end, Chu Fengmian chased it all the way. It took him half an hour to finally stop and kill the void beast with the life seal. Given Chu Fengmian's strength, he didn't need to use such methods to kill ordinary immortal generals. Even the best among the immortal generals, such as the Black and White Lords, didn't need to use so many methods to kill them. Even with Chu Fengmian's full strength, the void beast had almost escaped. This was the power of the Space Tao. This void beast had a very deep understanding of the Space Tao. It had been able to escape from desperate situations by tearing the space apart. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian had the bloodline of primogenitor Tianlong. He also had a deep understanding of the Space Tao, which allowed him to keep chasing it. In the end, with the help of the life seal, he finally killed the immortal general void beast. Chu Fengmian stopped in the void. There were a total of 7 mysterious void crystals in his hand. Among the 7 mysterious void crystals, one of them was 3 to 4 times the size of an ordinary mysterious void crystal. It was the mysterious void crystal he had obtained from killing the immortal general void beast. Chapter 2164. The spatial power contained in this mysterious void crystal alone was comparable to the spatial power contained in the other 6 mysterious void crystals combined. Chu Fengmian's efforts to slay the immortal general stage void beast had not been in vain. The spatial power within the mysterious void crystal was extremely gentle and much easier than refining pills. Chu Fengmian had already refined one mysterious void crystal before, so it was much easier for him to control it now. The 7 mysterious void crystals were completely refined in Chu Fengmian's palm and turned into extremely pure spatial power that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. As this pure spatial power entered Chu Fengmian's body, Chu Fengmian could clearly sense that his control over the surrounding space had increased slightly. Chu Fengmian tried his escape light. His escape light speed had increased by more than 50% compared to when he had first entered the depths of the void. This huge increase was due to the mysterious void crystals. However, Chu Fengmian also felt that the benefits he gained from devouring the mysterious void crystals this time were much weaker. Chu Fengmian also understood that although the mysterious void crystal was a crystallization of the spatial power of the realm, it would become weaker and weaker if it was devoured too much. After devouring these 7 mysterious void crystals, Chu Fengmian also felt that the benefits he would gain from devouring more mysterious void crystals would not be as great. There was no longer a need to go out of his way to hunt more void beasts. Chu Fengmian continued to follow the coordinates given by the upper sword execution chart as he advanced through the void. Although Chu Fengmian did not go out of his way to hunt void beasts, there was no lack of void beasts that sensed Chu Fengmian's aura and took the initiative to attack him. Martialist demonic celestials were also excellent supplements for void beasts. As long as they encountered a martialist demonic celestial, they would take the initiative to attack. Chu Fengmian did not evade these void beasts that took the initiative to attack him. Instead, he killed them one by one. Void beasts were extremely difficult to deal with. It would not be easy to escape from their clutches, so it was better to just kill them directly. Chu Fengmian did not devour the mysterious void crystals he had obtained. Instead, he stored them in his spatial ring. Although these mystic void crystals were useless to Chu Fengmian, they were absolutely priceless treasures to warriors and fey immortals who had yet to devour mystic void crystals. Whether Chu Fengmian gave them to Han Yueli, Luo Shi, and the others or sold them, they were all priceless. The depths of the void were boundless and pitch black. It was indeed very easy to get lost in it. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian had the upper sword executor's diagram to guide him. Otherwise, if it gave Chu Fengmian an approximate direction, it would be impossible for him to reach it. In the depths of the void beast was the only living creature. It was extremely peaceful, and normally, no martial artists would step into it. The emergence of the upper sword sect ruins had caused the void to become a lot livelier. Chu Fengmian could also sense that he wasn't the only one. Some other martial artists and fey immortals had also come to the void. These people should be sword cultivator powerhouses who had also obtained the upper sword executor's diagram. They had also entered the void to search for the upper sword sect ruins. Chu Fengmian sensed that one of the sword cultivators had entered the depths of the void and was not far from Chu Fengmian. However, the sword cultivator also sensed Chu Fengmian but did not meet him. Instead, he turned around and left. Although the martial artists and fey immortals holding the upper sword executor's diagram were all here for the inheritance of the upper sword sect and could be considered opponents, no one was willing to waste their energy on this. The real fight would only start when they entered the upper sword sect ruins. Wasting energy and clashing with others now would only benefit others. Chu Fengmian flew in the depths of the void for another 6 hours. Suddenly, his eyes lit up because he saw traces of spatial fluctuations in the pitch-black darkness before him. These spatial fluctuations had no form, so most martial artists and fey immortals wouldn't be able to detect them. However, Chu Fengmian's understanding of the space Tao had already surpassed most immortal generals. In addition, Chu Fengmian had obtained several mysterious void crystals after entering the void, which had deepened his understanding of the space Tao. This spatial fluctuation couldn't escape Chu Fengmian's eyes. According to the direction of the upper sword executor's diagram, it should be nearby. It seems like this is the pocket dimension at the entrance of the upper sword sect ruins. Chu Fengmian sized up the surroundings before flying towards the direction of the spatial fluctuation. The moment Chu Fengmian got close, his body was suddenly wrapped up by a spatial force. Chu Fengmian could sense that this spatial force didn't have any malicious intent. It just wanted to take him to a place. Chu Fengmian didn't resist. He had been waiting for this moment. His body was wrapped up by the spatial force and passed through countless layers of space. When Chu Fengmian finally opened his eyes, he was already in a pocket dimension. Blue skies and white clouds. This place looked very similar to the 9 domains. If Chu Fengmian hadn't sensed the difference in the surrounding space, he would have thought that he was already in the 9 domains. The upper sword sect is said to be divided into 2 parts, each occupying a pocket dimension. One part is the outer sect, which occupies this pocket dimension, known as the outer sword domain. The other part is occupied by the inner sect of the upper sword sect, known as the upper sword domain. Chu Fengmian observed his surroundings and muttered to himself. This should be the outer sword domain. Chu Fengmian looked at the outer sword domain. The outer sword domain was hundreds of times larger than the sword origin world. It was even larger than the entire 9 domains. Chu Fengmian activated his escape light and passed through it. He couldn't see the end of it. The outer sword domain of the upper sword sect was actually such a large pocket dimension. It was no wonder that the upper sword sect was one of the largest sects in the 9 domains. The outer sword domain was so large that the number of martial artists and demon immortals living in it was definitely not less than the 9 domains. Moreover, this was only a part of the upper sword sect. It was only the outer sect of the upper sword sect. The upper sword domain was the true core of the upper sword sect. The outer sword domain was similar to the sword principal city. It was a buffer zone between the Upper Sword sect and the 9 domains. Generally, the Upper Sword sect would open and recruit disciples in the various large cities in the Outer Sword domain. Only the inner sect disciples of the Upper Sword sect were qualified to enter the Upper Sword domain from the Outer Sword domain. In the Upper Sword sect, only the inner sect disciples were truly qualified to learn the sword techniques of the Upper Sword sect. Chapter 2165. The Outer Sword domain was as huge as the 9 domains. Even Chu Fengmian couldn't explore the entire Outer Sword domain in a short time. However, Chu Fengmian had already seen many huge cities built on the plains along the way. These cities were incomparably desolate and had turned into ruins. There seemed to have been a fierce battle on these ruins, which eventually led to the destruction of these cities. However, looking at the ruins in front of him, he couldn't imagine how prosperous the Outer Sword domain was in the past. This city was large enough to accommodate tens of millions of people. And such a city wasn't limited to just one. Chu Fengmian saw dozens of cities as he flew in the Outer Sword domain. Such a tyrannical sect couldn't escape destruction in the end. Chu Fengmian looked at the ruined cities and marveled in his heart. Just from the ruins alone, this high sword sect was the largest and most prosperous sect Chu Fengmian had ever seen. Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace and Pure Land Buddhist Temple were far inferior to the Upper Sword sect. However, what disappointed Chu Fengmian was that there was almost nothing useful left in these ruins. Chu Fengmian wasn't discouraged. His purpose of coming here was to obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. The inheritance of the Upper Sword sect was the most important thing. Chu Fengmian entered the Outer Sword domain and continued to follow the center of the Upper Sword execution chart. He flew all the way to the center of the Outer Sword domain. The spatial laws of the Outer Sword domain were different from those of the 9 domains. They were more condensed, so it was almost impossible to tear open the space here. Even Chu Fengmian couldn't tear the space apart in the Outer Sword domain. He could only fly in the form of an escape light. However, even if he used the escape light, he would still be suppressed by the space law. His speed was much slower than when he was in the 9 domains. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian's comprehension of the spatial Tao was far beyond that of ordinary immortal generals. His flying speed wasn't slow. Moreover, he had divine veins that could replenish his strength at any time without needing to rest. Otherwise, under the suppression of the powerful spatial laws, even immortal generals would have to stop to recover their strength after flying for a period of time. Chu Fengmian, on the other hand, didn't need to. He could fly in the direction of the sword execution chart. Finally, half an hour later, an incomparably huge city appeared in front of Chu Fengmian. This city was so big that it was much bigger than any city Chu Fengmian had ever seen. They occupied almost all of the 9 domains. The size of each domain was immeasurable, and the number of cultivators and fey immortals it could house was inestimable. One had to know that Chu Fengmian's current knowledge was far from what he had been in the past. The trip to the Songhai star system had also broadened his horizons. However, even the largest heaven-worshipping city in the vast sea star system couldn't compare to this huge city before them. This is the entrance to the Upper Sword sect, the largest city in the Outer Sword domain, Sword City. There were only 2 words in the name of this city, Sword City. However, these 2 words were the reason why countless experts yearned for this place in ancient times. There was a gate to the Upper Sword domain in Sword City. Only the disciples of the Upper Sword sect who cultivated here had the opportunity to enter the Upper Sword domain. In ancient times, countless cultivators and fey immortals who yearned to join the Upper Sword sect had settled down in Sword City, hoping that they could join the Upper Sword sect one day. During the prosperous times of the Upper Sword sect, there had been hundreds of millions of cultivators and fey immortals living in Sword City. Like the other cities in the Outer Sword domain, Sword City had been reduced to ruins after a great battle. However, Chu Fengmian could still clearly feel the prosperity of Sword City through the ruins. Chu Fengmian's gaze swept across Sword City. Finally, his gaze fell on the center of Sword City, where there was a huge ancient bronze door. This bronze door was tightly locked. At a glance, there were countless scars on this bronze door. There were tens of millions of scars. This bronze door seemed to have been besieged by countless experts. However, even such an intense siege couldn't shake the bronze door. The bronze door was still tightly shut. Even though the restrictions on the door were already broken, Chu Fengmian could still sense a power that made his heart tremble. Even if Chu Fengmian wanted to forcefully open this bronze door now, he would still die. This is the gate to the upper sword domain. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. Now, all the houses in Sword City had been reduced to ruins. Only this ancient bronze door was still standing. Even after tens of millions of years, it still stood in the center of Sword City. Even after tens of millions of years, the seal on it still could not be completely destroyed. The existence that created this bronze door was definitely powerful beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. Seems like someone has arrived before me. After observing the bronze door, Chu Fengmian looked at a mountain peak not far from the bronze door. On this mountain peak, a figure stood there. This figure stood on the mountain peak like a sharp sword, piercing the mountain peak. This was a middle-aged man with a cold expression. He carried a spiritual sword on his back that emitted a dazzling sword edge. However, the sword edge on this middle-aged man's body was not inferior to the spiritual sword on his back. This man's aura was extremely powerful. He was in the immortal general realm. However, Chu Fengmian could feel that this man was more powerful than Tianxing Jiandi and Black White Lord. There's always someone better than you. I thought Black and White Lord was already at the peak of the immortal general realm. I didn't expect there to be such an expert. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The appearance of the 9 domains had attracted countless experts. Even the geniuses of the 3 great saint realms had come to the 9 domains. Even Chu Fengmian had never heard of some of these powerful figures. Chu Fengmian had never heard of this cold-looking man. However, with his strength, if he competed with Chu Fengmian for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect, he would definitely become a formidable opponent. While Chu Fengmian was observing this cold-looking man, the cold-looking man also looked at Chu Fengmian. He was also carefully sizing up Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian and this cold-looking man had obviously obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token. That was why they were able to come to Sword City. Sword cultivators who obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token had only one purpose in coming to Sword City: to compete for the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. End of chapter. Chapter 2166. Chu Fengmian and the stern-looking man would have to fight over the Upper Sword sect's inheritance sooner or later. However, the two of them weren't in a hurry to make a move. There were a total of 12 Upper Sword Enforcer tokens. Over the past few days, Chu Fengmian had been observing the situation in the 9 zones. He also knew that all 12 Upper Sword Enforcer tokens had already appeared. Only the person who had the last laugh would be qualified to obtain the Upper Sword sect's inheritance. Now wasn't the time to make a move. Chu Fengmian and the stern-looking man were observing each other's strength. This sword intent. This person should be from the Assassin Tian sect. I don't know if he has obtained the inheritance of the ancient Assassin Tian sect, or if the Assassin Tian sect established a new sect in the extraterritorial starry sky. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself as he watched the stern-looking man. Although Chu Fengmian didn't know the identity of the stern-looking man, he could clearly sense the sword intent on his body. This was a sword technique that belonged to the Assassin Tian sect. The Assassin Tian sect was once a famous major sword sect in the history of the 9 zones. It was said that the core sword technique of the Assassin Tian sect, the sky-piercing sword technique, had been passed down from the Upper Sword sect. The stern-looking man's sword technique was indeed inherited from the assassin Tian sect. However, Chu Fengmian wasn't sure if this person had obtained the inheritance of the assassin Tian sect from the Nine Zones, or if he had come from the assassin Tian sect himself. Although the sky-piercing sword sect had been destroyed in the Nine Regions hundreds of thousands of years ago, Chu Fengmian knew that some sects that had disappeared in the Nine Regions hadn't been completely destroyed after he had gone to the Outer Realm. There were also some sects that had left the Nine Zones and established new sects in the extraterritorial starry sky. However, regardless of the stern-looking man's identity, he was definitely a formidable opponent for Chu Fengmian. The Sky-Piercer sword technique was famous for its Tao of assassination, and it was called the Sky-Piercer. It was an extremely formidable assassination technique, and once it was used suddenly, it was impossible to guard against. Some famous assassins in the history of the Nine Zones had cultivated the Sky-Piercing sword technique. The stern-looking man's strength was even more tyrannical than experts like the Black and White Young Lord. If he suddenly attacked and assassinated Chu Fengmian would be in great danger. Chu Fengmian would have to deal with him carefully. A's half-step celestial realm. It seems that you are the sect master of the Sword Dao sect, Chu Fengmian. While Chu Fengmian was observing the stern-looking man turned his head around and met Chu Fengmian's eyes. Then, he suddenly spoke. As soon as he opened, Fengmian recognized Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian wasn't surprised that someone had recognized him. He had already made a name for himself in the Nine Regions. He was no longer an unknown person. This was especially true for Chu Fengmian, who had subdued Patriarch Holy Spring and killed the Black and White Lords. Heavens would have been half-date Tian celestial Tians to the end. Chu Fengmian was the only one in the Nine Zones who had such a monstrous talent. Although the stern-looking man had never seen Chu Fengmian before, he recognized Chu Fengmian after taking a look at his aura and realm. That's right. You seem to be from the Sword Dao Tian sect. How should I address you? Chu Fengmian replied, You're right. The man was rather courteous. Sect Master Chu has good eyesight. When he heard Chu Fengmian point out his identity, the stern-looking man was a little shocked. He was different from Chu Fengmian. He had kept a very low profile during his time in the Nine Regions and had only made a move when he had snatched the upper sword execution token chart. Among the experts of the Nine Zones, there were not many who knew his identity and background. This was the first time he had met Chu Fengmian. The only reason Chu Fengmian could recognize him was because Chu Fengmian recognized the Sword Dao on him. I'm from the Sword Dao Tian sect. My name is Brilliant Void Sky Piercer. The stern-looking man, Brilliant Void Sky Piercer, looked at Chu Fengmian and said, Brilliant Void Sky Piercer? Chu Fengmian repeated the name in his heart. It was an extremely strange name. However, Chu Fengmian didn't care. The extraterritorial starry sky was vast and boundless. Chu Fengmian had seen many people with strange names. Although this name was different from ordinary names, it wasn't enough to make Chu Fengmian make a fuss. It is said that the Sword Dao sect has inherited the sword techniques of the Lord of the Sword Dao. Sect Master Chu has also inherited the sword intent of the Lord of the Sword Dao. Am I right? Brilliant Void Sky Piercer raised his head and looked at Chu Fengmian. That's right. Our Sword Dao sect's sword techniques are indeed inherited from the Lord of the Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian nodded. He didn't need to hide this matter. Chu Fengmian wanted to rebuild the Sword Dao sect and restore the glory of the Sword Dao sect under the Lord of the Sword Dao 10,000 years ago. Hiding the head and showing the tail wasn't Chu Fengmian's style. Very well. I'm not talented, but I would like to experience the supreme sword techniques of the Lord of the Sword Dao. I wonder if Sect Master Chu is willing to teach me? Brilliant Void Sky Piercer fixed his gaze on Chu Fengmian. His eyes were filled with boundless fighting spirit. Chu Fengmian could see that this fighting spirit came from the bottom of his heart. Brilliant Void Sky Piercer was an out-and-out sword Dao madman. In his life, he had challenged countless sword Dao experts. Now that he saw Chu Fengmian, the first thing he wanted to do was challenge Chu Fengmian. Sword Dao madmen and martial Dao madmen weren't rare in the history of the 9 domains. There would be such madmen in every era. They wholeheartedly pursued martial arts and only wanted to challenge the strongest experts. They honed their strength through battle after battle. Brilliant Void Sky Piercer was a sword Dao madman. He had long heard of the Lord of the Sword Dao. Now that Chu Fengmian had inherited the inheritance of the Lord of the Sword Dao, the first thing he wanted to do was challenge Chu Fengmian. It can't be considered teaching me. If you are willing to fight, I will keep you company. Chu Fengmian didn't hesitate. He immediately agreed the moment Brilliant Void Sky Piercer said that. Chu Fengmian had never been afraid of any challenges. Furthermore, Brilliant Void Sky Piercer's strength could be considered a formidable opponent of Chu Fengmian's. Fighting him would be a huge benefit for Chu Fengmian. It could increase Chu Fengmian's strength. There were no experts. They had to go into seclusion and cultivate bitterly. Only through battle after battle could they become stronger. Great! Sect Master Chu is indeed a straightforward person. Brilliant Void Sky Piercer's face lit up when he saw Chu Fengmian agree. A wave of shocking sword intent erupted from his body. The spiritual sword on his back was suddenly unsheathed. Dazzling sword intent shrouded the spiritual sword. End of chapter. Chapter 2167. The moment Kungsu Skypiercer's sword intent burst forth, Chu Fengmian was also fully prepared. He unsheathed the ancestral dragon supreme sword and held it tightly in his hand. Kungsu Skypiercer was an extremely powerful sword Dao expert. Chu Fengmian had to give it his all and be fully prepared to fight against him. Although the two of them had yet to make a move in the Sword City, they were still accumulating their strength. However, the sword intents bursting out from their backs were already clashing in the air. In a fight between sword cultivators, in addition to strength, it was more about sword Dao and the collision of sword intent. Chu Fengmian and Kungsu Skypiercer did not really make a move. Instead, they chose to use the collision of sword intent to test each other's strength. The two sword intents collided in the air. The sword intent was invisible. However, 4 sword cultivators like Chu Fengmian and Kungsu Skypiercer, just their sword intent alone was enough to kill. In the center of the collision of sword intents, even some celestial realm experts might end up dying if they rashly charged in. The two sword intents collided in the air. Kungsu Skypiercer cultivated the Skypiercer sword technique. His sword intent was strange and contained extreme sharpness. The Skypiercer sword technique was an assassin's sword technique. As an assassin, he had to kill with a single strike. Therefore, the power of this sword was extremely sharp. Once the brilliant Void Heaven Piercer found an opening, he would be able to kill even an immortal general expert with a single strike with his Heaven Piercer sword art. Compared to the extreme Kuan Su's sky-piercing sword intent, Chu Fengmian's sword intent was like an ocean that could contain hundreds of rivers. As the two sword intents collided, Chu Fengmian's sword intent changed countless times. Each collision seemed to be completely different. Massacre sword technique? Sky extinction sword technique? Extreme spiritual sword technique? How many sword techniques has this person cultivated? I can't even tell. His sword intent seems to have hundreds and thousands of sword intents, but it's a little different. It has the power of 100 rivers. I've never seen such a sword intent. Kungsu Skypiercer was stunned when he sensed Chu Fengmian's sword intent. The name of the brilliant Void Sky Piercer might not be well known in the 9 regions, but he was a renowned sword cultivator in the entire starry sky outside the starry sky. Although he only cultivated the sky-piercing sword art, he had heard of many famous and powerful sword art. However, the moment he saw Chu Fengmian's sword intent, Kungsu Heaven Piercer was still a little stunned. Even with his knowledge, he was unable to tell which sword technique Chu Fengmian mainly cultivated. Although any sword cultivator could cultivate many kinds of sword principles, most of the sword principles that they cultivated were used as support. The true foundation was only one sword technique, just like the heaven-piercing sword technique that the brilliant Void Heaven Piercer had cultivated. However, the Kungsu Sky Piercer could sense that Chu Fengmian's sword intent contained hundreds to thousands of sword technique. Furthermore, each of these sword techniques seemed to be a major sword technique. Even with his experience, he still could not understand the origin of Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship. Impressive, impressive. He is worthy of inheriting the inheritance of the Sword Path Master. I have never seen such a sword technique before. The brilliant Void Sky Piercer observed a few times, but was unable to see what sword technique Chu Fengmian was cultivating. Thus, he gave up and spoke indifferently. It seems like we can only see the truth through a fight. Since the brilliant Void Sky Piercer could not see the true origin of Chu Fengmian's sword technique, they could only exchange blows. The brilliant Void Sky Piercer is indeed a sword path genius to be able to cultivate the sky-piercing sword technique to such a mysterious level. On the other side, Chu Fengmian had already understood most of the brilliant Void Sky Piercer's sword technique the moment he clashed with it. The sky-piercing sword technique is not considered the most powerful sword technique among the thousands of sword technique. However, the brilliant Void Sky Piercer has already comprehended the sky-piercing sword technique to its peak. If the brilliant Void Sky had chosen to assassinate an immortal marquee powerhouse, he would have had a chance of succeeding. However, the brilliant Void Sky Piercer had taken the initiative to challenge Chu Fengmian and gave up on his most powerful assassination technique. If the brilliant Void Sky Piercer had come directly to assassinate Chu Fengmian would be in great danger if he was not careful. Although he would not die, he would still be injured. However, since the brilliant Void Sky Piercer had chosen to fight Chu Fengmian head-on, Chu Fengmian was not afraid at all. Make your move. Chu Fengmian held the ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and stood on the Sword City, looking coldly at the brilliant Void Sky Piercer. Chu Fengmian did not panic in the face of the brilliant Void Sky Piercer. He was extremely calm. This calmness surprised Kungsu the Heaven Piercer. Given his reputation, any true immortal generals would be extremely nervous, fearful, or even serious when facing him. They would show all sorts of different expressions. However, Chu Fengmian was the only one who was as calm as him. It was as if the brilliant Void Sky Piercer's attack would not affect his state of mind at all. This was an attitude that could only be displayed when one was extremely confident. The brilliant Void Sky Piercer did not know where Chu Fengmian's confidence came from. However, the fighting spirit in his eyes surged even more. The stronger Chu Fengmian was, the more interested he would be. The more the brilliant Void Sky Piercer wanted to fight Chu Fengmian. Buzz! Suddenly, the sword in the brilliant Void Sky Piercer's hand moved. His sword flashed and turned into a sword light that shot towards Chu Fengmian. Boom! However, as the brilliant Void Sky Piercer unleashed his sword, the center of the Sword City was suddenly torn open and turned into a spatial passageway. At that moment, another person came from the depths of the void to the Sword City in the outer sword domain. Two figures slowly walked out of the spatial passageway. This time around, the two people who had actually come together. The brilliant Void Sky Piercer's eyes flickered when he saw the two figures. There was a hint of fear in his eyes. The sword light in his hand suddenly disappeared. Then, the brilliant Void Sky Piercer spoke to Chu Fengmian. It seems like today is not a good time to fight. As he spoke, the brilliant Void Sky Piercer also put away the spiritual sword in his hand, indicating that he had stopped. Originally, only Chu Fengmian and the brilliant Void Sky Piercer were in the Sword City. The brilliant Void Sky Piercer wanted to fight Chu Fengmian. End of chapter. Chapter 2168. However, the sudden arrival of someone made the brilliant void sky-piercer stop. Although the battle between Chu Fengmian and the brilliant void sky-piercer was not a battle of life and death, they had to face it with all their might. If someone suddenly launched a sneak attack at that time, it would be a disaster for both of them. Therefore, when some experts fought, they would choose some secret places to avoid being detected by others and being ambushed. It was not only the brilliant void sky-piercer. Chu Fengmian also put away the thought of fighting with the brilliant void sky-piercer when he saw that someone had arrived. The brilliant void sky-piercer's sky-piercing sword technique had reached the great success stage. Even Chu Fengmian wanted to have a contest with him to observe the brilliant void sky-piercer's sky-piercing sword technique. The 9-region sword technique that Chu Fengmian created was meant to accommodate all the sword techniques in the world and give birth to the best sword technique in the world. Chu Fengmian felt that he had gained some insights from the confrontation with the brilliant void sky-piercer's sword intent. It would be extremely beneficial for Chu Fengmian to have a real battle with the brilliant void sky-piercer. However, the sudden arrival of someone had dispelled all of this. Chu Fengmian did not dare to take the risk of fighting with the brilliant void sky-piercer. After all, the martial artists and Fey immortals who came to Sword City were ultimately there for the inheritance of the sword sect. Every sword cultivator who possessed the upper sword execution token illustration was hostile to each other. At this moment, no one would miss the opportunity to kill one of them. Chu Fengmian stopped and looked at the sky above Sword City. The spatial passage that had been torn open gradually disappeared. Only 2 figures were left. One was an old man and the other was a young man. Both of them contained sharp sword intent, but their swordsmanship was different. It seemed that they were not from the same sword sect. However, the 2 of them had come together. Obviously, they had joined forces. Are they experts from the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance? Chu Fengmian suddenly felt a sense of familiarity when he saw the old man and the young man. He observed carefully and found that the 2 of them were experts from the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance. Chu Fengmian had killed Tianxing Jiandi. Not only had he devoured Tianxing Jiandi's blood essence, but he had also obtained Tianxing Jiandi's memories, allowing him to recognize the old man and the young man. The old man's name was Flying Sword Emperor. He was one of the true giants in the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance. His status was even higher than Tianxing Jiandi, Martial Ghost Old Ancestor, and the others. His strength was unfathomable. Although they were also at the Immortal General Realm, it was easy for them to defeat demon immortals who were also at the Immortal General Realm. It was said that the Flying Sword Emperor had been cultivating for 100,000 years in the Immortal General Realm. His strength had reached an unimaginable level. He was considered undefeatable among the immortal generals. The young man was Blood Shadow Sword Master. It was said that he came from Lihan Heaven, one of the 3 great sacred realms. It was unknown why he had joined the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance. In terms of strength, the Blood Shadow Sword Master's strength should be below the Flying Sword Emperor. However, in Tianxing Jiandi's memories, he was extremely afraid of the Blood Shadow Sword Master. This person's swordsmanship was extremely strange. Coming from the 3 great sacred realms, Tianxing Jiandi did not dare to act rashly against him. This time, the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance had obtained 2 upper sword execution portraits. The strength of the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance is more powerful than I imagined. Chu Fengmian looked at the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master with a fearful expression. Others might not know, but Chu Fengmian knew. If Chu Fengmian had not killed the Heavenly Sacred Sword Emperor, it would have been equivalent to obtaining 3 upper sword execution portraits in the 100 Ultimate Star Regions Alliance. There were a total of 12 upper sword execution portraits, and the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance had obtained 3 of them. This showed the strength of the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance among the 9 domains, where experts were as common as clouds. Tianqing Jiandi's strength was not even considered the strongest in the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance. There were some secrets that Chu Fengmian did not know, but he understood how terrifying the hidden strength of the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance was. While Chu Fengmian was observing, the Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Sword Master also looked at Chu Fengmian and Brilliant Void Sky Piercer. Finally, the Blood Shadow Sword Master's gaze fell on Chu Fengmian, and a trace of surprise flashed in his eyes. Although Brilliant Void Sky Piercer's reputation was not well known in the 9 domains, he was still a well-known expert in the entire extraterritorial star domain. They were not surprised that Brilliant Void Sky Piercer had obtained an upper sword execution portrait. However, it was indeed strange that Chu Fengmian, a half-step celestial being, was standing there. It should be known that even immortal generals might not be able to keep the upper sword execution portrait in their hands. In the past few days, several immortal generals had fallen because of this upper sword execution portrait. Now that Chu Fengmian could strut around Sword City, it was clear that he had also obtained an upper sword execution order diagram. This must be Sect Master Chu of the Sword Dao Sect. The Blood Shadow Sword Master's lips moved. Just as he was about to speak, the Flying Sword Emperor beside him spoke first. He looked at Chu Fengmian and said directly, "The Sword Dao Sect?" When the Blood Shadow Sword Master heard this name, he suddenly remembered that the upper sword execution portrait that had first appeared had come from the Sword Dao Sect. In order to fight for the upper sword execution portrait in Chu Fengmian's hands, an immortal general expert, Ancestor Holy Spring, had been subdued and turned into hard work. It had even caused the black and white young lords to fall. Although the Blood Shadow Sword Master had not seen this with his own eyes, he had heard that Chu Fengmian, the sect master of the Sword Dao sect, had obtained the sword intent of the master of the Sword Dao. With the sword intent of the master of the Sword Dao, he could contend against immortal generals. "You are that lucky lad?" The Blood Shadow Sword Master looked at Chu Fengmian with disdain in his eyes. In his opinion, Chu Fengmian was at most a lucky lad. Even if he had obtained the sword intent of the master of the Sword Dao, it did not mean that Chu Fengmian was powerful. After all, the power of a wisp of sword intent was lost every time it was consumed. It would eventually dissipate completely. At that time, Chu Fengmian, who was a half-step celestial being, would be no different from an ant in his eyes. After knowing Chu Fengmian's identity, the Blood Shadow Sword Master did not put Chu Fengmian in his eyes at all. "Let me give you a piece of advice. Leave obediently now lest you lose your life. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Dao sect is not something that a lad like you is qualified to fight for." The Blood Shadow Sword Master's tone was extremely disdainful. Although he said that he was advising Chu Fengmian, it sounded like he was dismissing an ant. "Is that so? It is not up to you whether I am qualified to fight for it or not. However, let me give you a piece of advice. If you still dare to fight for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Dao sect, you will only end up dead," Chu Fengmian said coldly. End of chapter. Chapter 2169. Since the Blood Shadow Sword Master had provoked him directly, Chu Fengmian would naturally not be polite. A mere half-step celestial being ant dares to speak so arrogantly? Do you really think that you're invincible just because you had some fortuitous encounters? Die. The Blood Shadow Sword Master was enraged when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Suddenly, a blood-red sword light slashed towards Chu Fengmian. This sword light contained boundless killing intent. The Blood Shadow Sword technique was one of the sword techniques that focused on killing. It was extremely powerful. Even an immortal general sword cultivator expert might not be able to react in time to the sudden slash of the sword. He used his killing move without saying a word. The Blood Shadow Sword Master wanted to kill Chu Fengmian the moment he attacked. Just this little blood shadow sword technique? You dare to use it in front of me? Kill. Chu Fengmian sneered when he saw the blood-red sword light slashing towards him. Suddenly, a sword was unsheathed in his hand. Then, a surge of killing intent was emitted and slashed towards the blood shadow sword master. The power of this sword was much more powerful than the blood shadow sword master's sword light. Suddenly, the two sword lights collided in the air. The blood shadow sword master's sword light was instantly broken by the collision. A surge of sword essence slashed towards the blood shadow sword master. Chu Fengmian actually gained the upper hand in this move. The blood shadow sword master did not seem to have expected this. When he saw Chu Fengmian's sword light slashing towards him, he immediately condensed his immortal power and formed a barrier in front of him. However, before this barrier could fully condense, Chu Fengmian's sword light had already slashed towards it. Instantly, the barrier was shattered. The overbearing sword light slashed towards the blood shadow overlord. PFFF. The sword light slashed into the blood shadow swordmaster's chest. Immediately, the blood shadow swordmaster's body was sent flying and he spat out blood. The Flying Sword Emperor and Kungsu Sky Piercer were shocked when they saw this scene. They blinked their eyes as if they were trying to confirm the scene in front of them. They could not believe that the blood shadow sword master had lost so miserably in this exchange. The blood shadow sword master had taken the initiative to attack. However, he was struck by Chu Fengmian's counterattack and injured him. If the blood shadow sword master did not react at the last moment and used his immortal power to form a barrier to block Chu Fengmian's attack, the blood shadow sword master was the blood shadow sword master on the spot. The shadow sword master was the sword master. The shadow sword master was sword master to was the blood sword master was sword master. Was the blood shadow sword master was unfathomable and unfathomable. Sword master to the sword master to sword master was to be defeated to him to take to the end master to be defeated to him. To fang sword master as sword master to attack. Was to him Fen Fengmian. Fain to him was to the end sword masters. Fen. Was to twos. Was to be, to blood was to be. Kill him while he was down. Chu Fengmian would never show mercy to his enemies. Whoosh. The sword light in Chu Fengmian's hand moved. Murderous intent surged and merged into the sword edge. Suddenly, it turned into a blood-red sword light and slashed towards the blood shadow sword master. The power of this blood-red sword light was even more powerful than the previous one. It was tens of thousands of feet long, and it slashed towards the blood shadow sword master from all directions. The blood shadow sword master had just been sent flying. Before he could even take a breather, Chu Fengmian attacked him again. His face was filled with fear as he hurriedly mobilized his immortal force to prepare his strength. However, Chu Fengmian's sword light was faster than he had imagined. Before the blood shadow sword master could complete his immortal force, Chu Fengmian's sword light had already slashed towards him. At this critical moment, a sword light slashed from the side. This sword light collided with the sword light formed by Chu Fengmian's massacre swordsmanship. Immediately, the two forces were neutralized. The person who attacked was the Flying Sword Monarch. Seeing that the blood shadow sword master was in danger, the Flying Sword Monarch could not help but attack as well. The blood shadow sword master was an expert of the 100 Extremes Star Domain Alliance. The Flying Sword Monarch would not sit idly by and watch the blood shadow sword master be killed by Chu Fengmian. Why? Both of you want to come at me together? Chu Fengmian said coldly when he saw the Flying Sword Monarch attacking. Although the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master were strong when they joined forces, Chu Fengmian was not afraid of them. This is not the time to fight to the death. Sect Master Chu, you don't want others to take advantage of you, right? The Flying Sword Monarch said to Chu Fengmian. He did not attack. His eyes suddenly scanned the surroundings. In Sword City, other than Chu Fengmian, the Flying Sword Monarch, the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the Kuan-Su Sky Piercer, many other sword cultivator experts had arrived. In the entire Sword City, there were already 8 sword cultivator experts. During this battle, there were more sword cultivator experts who had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token Chart that came to Sword City. Every Upper Sword Execution Token Chart had a map that led the sword cultivator experts who had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token Chart to Sword City and wait for the opening of the Upper Sword Sect's ruins. There was less than half a day left before the opening of the Upper Sword Sect. Those sword cultivator experts who had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token Chart had already rushed over. These people did not have the intention to attack when they saw the conflict between Chu Fengmian, the Flying Sword Monarch, and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. However, they were watching from the side and waiting for an opportunity. If one of them was really forced into a desperate situation, or if both sides suffered great losses, they would not mind eliminating an enemy in advance. The Flying Sword Monarch also saw this point. Therefore, he did not have the intention to continue fighting with Chu Fengmian. If Chu Fengmian was weak and the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master could easily kill him, the two of them would have other thoughts at this time. However, the strength that Chu Fengmian had displayed during the clash between the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the Flying Sword Monarch had already made it clear that Chu Fengmian's strength was not inferior to theirs. Even if the two of them joined forces to deal with Chu Fengmian, they would have to pay a great price. In the end, both sides would suffer great losses. The Blood Shadow Sword Master, the Flying Sword Monarch, the Kuan-Su Sky Piercer, and even Chu Fengmian had come to Sword City for the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. If they were to engage in a bloody battle at this time, it would only allow the others to reap the benefits. End of chapter. Chapter 2170. This time, the Flying Sword Sovereign allowed the Blood Shadow Sword Master to take action because he wanted to test Chu Fengmian's strength. After all, although there were many rumors about Chu Fengmian's strength, Chu Fengmian was only at the half-step celestial being realm. They were also doubtful about some of the rumors about Chu Fengmian's strength. This time, the Blood Shadow Sword Master had already tested Chu Fengmian's strength by exchanging blows with him. Chu Fengmian's strength was comparable to the rumors. Naturally, there was no reason for the Blood Shadow Sword Master to fight to the death. Let's wait until we reach the Sword Sect relic before deciding the victor, the Flying Sword Sovereign said as he turned into a ray of light and left Chu Fengmian's sight. The two of them went to another region of Sword City and separated from Chu Fengmian. When we reach the Sword Sect relic, it will be the time of your death. The Blood Shadow Sword Master glanced at Chu Fengmian coldly before turning into a ray of light and leaving with the Flying Sword Sovereign. This time, he had almost been killed by Chu Fengmian in front of so many people. He had lost all his face. For immortal generals, face was more important than life. Therefore, some immortal generals wouldn't be willing to submit to others even if they were forced into a desperate situation. Chu Fengmian had humiliated the Blood Shadow Sword Master greatly. If he did not kill Chu Fengmian, he would not be able to lift his head in the 9 regions in the future. I'll be waiting, Chu Fengmian said indifferently. He had no intention to stop them. Chu Fengmian had no intention of fighting a bloody battle with the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. His objective was to obtain the inheritance of the Sword Sect. If he were to reveal too much of his strength now, it wouldn't do him any good. This time, there were more and more experts in Sword City. These sword cultivator experts were waiting for an opportunity to deal with others. Chu Fengmian also did not want to be taken advantage of. He also occupied a region of Sword City and stood in the air. This conflict ended just like that. In a short while, another spatial tunnel appeared and more sword cultivator experts came to Sword City. In less than 4 hours, a total of 12 sword cultivator experts had gathered in Sword City. These 12 sword cultivator experts were the ones who had obtained the sword execution token portrait. Sword cultivators who were not on the sword execution chart were not qualified to enter the outer sword domain, let alone Sword City. As they approached the outer sword region, the power of space was screening these sword cultivators to see if they were qualified to enter the outer sword region. Only sword cultivators who obtained the sword execution token illustration could enter Sword City. Just as Chu Fengmian had guessed, there were indeed a total of 12 sword cultivators who had come this time. It seemed that the opening of the upper sword sect's ruins and the distribution of the upper sword execution token were indeed the same as the ancient rules. There would be a total of 12 sword cultivators who would come to compete for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Zhuo Jianfan, Sword Emperor Liu, Divine Wood Sword Emperor Chu Fengmian's eyes were also observing the sword cultivator powerhouses that had arrived. Now that he had obtained the memories of the black and white masters of Tianxing Jiendi, he had some understanding of the powerhouses that had entered the 9 zones. Chu Fengmian could already recognize the identities of some of them with a single glance. They were all famous sword cultivators in the outer realm starry skies. For example, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was an immortal general expert who had been famous for a long time. This person had been in the immortal general realm for hundreds of thousands of years. His immortal power was unbelievably strong. It was said that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had the ability to enter the profound heaven realm long ago. However, in order to cultivate his swordsmanship, he had not broken through. Although this person was only in the immortal general realm, his true strength was no different from an immortal marquis of the profound heaven realm. The moment Chu Fengmian felt the aura of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, he felt an incomparable fear. The strength of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was far below that of the Black and White Masters. Even if the Black and White Masters joined forces, they might not be a match for the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. There was actually such a powerhouse among the sword cultivators competing for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. Not only Chu Fengmian, but some of the other sword cultivator powerhouses in Sword City also had incomparable fear in their eyes when they saw the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. Clearly, the strength of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was something that others were incomparably fearful of. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was leisurely standing in the sky above the center of Sword City, looking at the huge bronze gate in the center of Sword City. Other than the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, the other sword cultivator powerhouses were almost all famous powerhouses. The weakest of them had reached the level of the Tianxing Jiendi and the Black and White Masters. They were all figures who were countless times more powerful than ordinary immortal general powerhouses. As for the weaker ones, even if they had the opportunity to obtain the upper sword execution order diagram, they would not be able to keep it. It was only possible that one person would die and the diagram would change owners. It seems that the Tianjian sect paid such a huge price to obtain an upper sword execution order diagram. Other than the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, a young man attracted Chu Fengmian's attention the most. This young man was dressed in a long robe, and his gaze was like a sword. The other people present might not know his swordsmanship, but Chu Fengmian knew it very well. This was the swordsmanship of the Tianjian sect. Previously, the Tianjian sect had sent people from the sky-reaching pavilion to buy the upper sword execution order diagram in Chu Fengmian's hands. They were even willing to spend a sword Dao totem and a sky-high price of 3 immortal artifacts. Clearly, the Tianjian sect was determined to obtain the upper sword execution order diagram. After hitting a wall with Chu Fengmian, the Tianjian sect seemed to have found someone else. It was unknown whether they had bought it or obtained an upper sword execution order diagram, but they had succeeded in the end. Chu Fengmian felt that this young man's appearance was somewhat unfamiliar. Clearly, he was not someone from 10,000 years ago. Chu Fengmian knew all the powerhouses of the Tianjian sect from 10,000 years ago. This young man was clearly a genius who had risen to prominence in the last 10,000 years. However, his strength had already reached the peak of the immortal general realm. He has inherited the most orthodox flying celestial sword technique and made the Tianjin sect pay such a huge price to obtain the upper sword execution order diagram. It seems that this person is a genius that the Tianjin sect has focused on nurturing in this generation. They want to cultivate him into an invincible swordsman. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but think to himself as he looked at the young man. The swordsmanship that this young man cultivated was the flying celestial sword technique. As one of the 7 major sects, the Tianjin sect might have many swordsmanship. Just the disciples of the Tianjin sect alone had cultivated dozens of swordsmanship. However, among all the swordsmanships of the Tianjin sect, the flying celestial sword technique was the most powerful one. It was the most precious swordsmanship of the Tianjin sect. In the Tianjin sect, only the sect masters of each generation were qualified to learn it. End of chapter. Chapter 2171. The young man in front of him wasn't wearing the clothes of the Tianjin sect's sect master, but he cultivated the flying celestial sword technique. The Tianjin sect was willing to break the rules to cultivate this young man. Now, he spent a lot of money to obtain the sword execution token chart. The Tianjin sect had high hopes for this young man. When Chu Fengmian looked at the young man, his eyes were filled with cold, killing intent. Chu Fengmian and the Tianjin sect had an irreconcilable feud. Sooner or later, Chu Fengmian would attack the Tianjin sect and destroy the Tianjin sect. If he could kill this young man, it would be equivalent to destroying the genius that the Tianjin sect had painstakingly cultivated. It would make the Tianjin sect's painstaking efforts go down the drain. But now wasn't the time to make a move. Chu Fengmian felt that this young man's strength was definitely not below the Kungsu Sky Piercer and the Flying Sword Emperor. Even if Chu Fengmian attacked with all his strength, it would be difficult to kill him. He had to find a suitable opportunity. Chu Fengmian wasn't in a hurry. When he reached the Tianjin sect's ruins, he would naturally find a chance to kill this young man. After observing everyone, Chu Fengmian still stood in the area of Sword City, waiting for the day when the Sword sect's ruins would open. A remnant of the Sword Dao sect. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the young man also noticed Chu Fengmian. His eyes were filled with killing intent as he muttered to himself. This person said that he inherited the inheritance of the Sword Dao Master. But according to the ancestors' guesses, this person is probably related to the Sword Dao sect from 10,000 years ago. Many of the Sword Dao sect's secret treasures suddenly disappeared when the Sword Dao sect was destroyed 10,000 years ago. Perhaps this person obtained them. Once I kill this person, all of them will be mine. The young man sneered. Xian Songtian, how about you and I join forces? At this moment, a figure suddenly appeared beside the young man and said. This figure was also a young man. He was in high spirits and his aura wasn't inferior to the Tianjin sect's genius, Xian Songtian. Gu Qianjun? Why? Is the Jiuyu Valley also eyeing the Sword Dao sect? Xian Songtian asked when he saw the newcomer. Swordsmanship? Our Jiuyu Canyon doesn't cultivate sword techniques. What use do we have for the Sword Dao sect's sword techniques? But I'm interested in the treasures of the Sword Dao sect. Gu Qianjun sneered. He glanced at Chu Fengmian and said, who doesn't want the treasures of the Sword Dao Gate? It's a pity that this brat is now fully fledged and not easy to deal with. How about it, Xian Songtian? Are you interested in working together? Cooperate? How? Xian Songtian's eyes flickered as he pondered for a moment. It's simple. Let's work together and kill this kid. I don't need the Sword Dao sect's sword arts, they'll all belong to you. As for the Sword Dao sect's treasures, I want 60%. How about it? Gu Qianjun said. 60%? You sure have a big appetite. Xian Songtian snorted coldly when he heard Gu Qianjuan's condition. The greatest treasure in the Sword Principle sect is the swordsmanship of the former master of Sword Principle. As for the rest, they are nothing. Gu Qianjun ignored Xian Songtian's attitude and continued to speak. This brat is not easy to deal with. You should have heard about what happened in the Sword Origin world. Neither of us can kill him in a one-on-one fight. If we don't work together and let this brat escape, no one will benefit. Moreover, you should know that the Tianjian sect was the first to attack the Sword Dao sect. If this brat grows up, the first to be destroyed will be the Tianjian sect. Gu Qianjun spoke again when he saw that Xian Songtian was still hesitating. This sentence seemed to have dispelled all of Xian Songtian's hesitation. Let's do as you say. Let's work together and kill this brat, Xian Songtian said directly. Well, let's not act rashly now. When we reach the Shang Sword sect's ruins, it will be our chance to act. Didn't the Tianjian sect inherit part of the Shang Sword sect's inheritance? You should know something about the ruins, right? Gu Qianjun asked. That's right. I know some of the dangerous ruins in the Shang Sword sect. When we enter, we will lure this brat there and kill him directly. Gu Qianjun and Xian Songtian used some means to block their discussion so that the people around them could not hear them. Chu Fengmian, on the other hand, knew very well that the two of them had joined hands, and even the methods they had used to deal with Chu Fengmian had heard everything clearly. When Chu Fengmian arrived at Sword City, he quietly used the power of the Life Seal and his control of the Space Force to envelop the space around Sword City. Although Chu Fengmian couldn't completely seal off the entire Sword City, he could hear every conversation between every sword cultivator clearly. Want to work together to deal with me? Guyu Canyon Tianjian sect? It seems that my growth has finally attracted the attention of the old fogies of the 7 major sections. However, with my current strength, whoever dares to deal with me is courting death. Chu Fengmian's heart flashed with killing intent. When they arrived at the Shang Sword sect ruins, Chu Fengmian could find a chance to kill Xian Songtian and Gu Qianjun together. Rumble! At this moment, a shocking sword intent burst out from the center of Sword City. Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered as he looked at the giant bronze door at the center of Sword City. The shocking sword intent was emitted from the bronze door. Ancient runes appeared on the copper door. The power of immortality that had existed for tens of millions of years was unleashed at this moment. For a moment, the sword cultivators near the bronze door retreated, not daring to fight against it. Chu Fengmian could feel that the remaining energy on the bronze door was enough to easily destroy countless immortal generals. The number 1 sword sect, the Shang Sword sect. Chu Fengmian was shocked when he sensed the energy on the bronze door. Even after thousands of years, the broken bronze door could still emit such terrifying energy. Chu Fengmian could not imagine how terrifying the Shang Sword sect was when it was at its peak. Unless he personally went to that era and saw it with his own eyes, he would not be able to see it clearly. As the ancient runes and forbidding auras on the copper door were awakened, the power of the sword intent grew stronger. Half an hour later, the power suddenly reached its limit. When the energy reached its limit, the sealed ancient bronze door slowly opened. End of chapter. Chapter 2172. It's open! The relic of the Upper Sword sect is finally open. Seeing the huge ancient bronze door slowly open, countless sword cultivator experts looked over, their eyes filled with excitement. The first sword sect was the Upper Sword sect. The Upper Sword sect represented the most ancient Sword Dao inheritance. The unparalleled sword technique of the Upper Sword sect was one of the top 10 ancient celestial techniques. Whoever obtained the Upper Sword sect's inheritance would reach the sky in a single bound. Just for the Upper Sword Execution Order chart, there were countless bloody storms in the 9 regions. A large number of celestial generals fell one after another. There was no doubt that all the sword cultivators present were here for the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. Numerous pairs of eyes stared intently at the enormous ancient bronze door. Behind the bronze door was the real relic of the Upper Sword Sect. The Upper Sword Sect's inheritance was hidden inside. Whoever entered first would have the upper hand. Every sword cultivator present held their breaths and gathered their strength, ready to attack at any time and charge in. However, no one dared to approach the huge ancient bronze door. The sword intent that erupted from the huge ancient bronze door caused their hearts to involuntarily tremble. Right now, if anyone were to recklessly approach and be sucked in by this power, they would only be on the path to death. It was said that the Upper Sword Sect had given birth to 3 celestial emperors, countless celestial sovereigns, and countless celestial lords. Even though there was a restriction on the ancient bronze door, it was still not something that the people present could resist after thousands of years. Therefore, before the ancient bronze door opened completely and the power dissipated, no one dared to approach it. Time ticked by. Everyone present tensed up as they stared intently at the huge ancient bronze door. They watched as the bronze door gradually opened. Behind the bronze door was a deep and dark tunnel. Only by passing through the tunnel could one enter the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. The Upper Sword Sect's inheritance was not in the Outer Sword domain, but in a separate small world. Isn't this the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance? What is this place? Chu Fengmian was standing not too far away from the massive, ancient bronze door. His eyes were fixed on the spatial tunnel that had appeared after the bronze door had opened. Although his expression was calm, his heart was in turmoil. The spatial tunnel behind the ancient copper door was extremely deep. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to see it clearly, but Chu Fengmian possessed the bloodline of progenitor Tianlong. He had also hunted the void beasts in the depths of the void and devoured a lot of mysterious void crystals, so his control of the Tao of space had improved. Chu Fengmian was just testing the waters. He wanted to see where the spatial tunnel led to. Above the spatial tunnel, there were many restriction arrays that were difficult to detect. However, after thousands of years, most of the restriction arrays had been shattered. Chu Fengmian investigated and saw that there was a huge palace behind the spatial tunnel. It was a complete palace and not a ruin. This shocked Chu Fengmian greatly. The destruction of the Upper Sword Sect was recorded in the ancient book. Although there were many different opinions, the fact that the Upper Sword Sect had been destroyed was recorded in every ancient book. When Chu Fengmian came to the Outer Sword domain this time, he saw that the cities in the Outer Sword domain had been reduced to ruins. This also proved that there was no difference from what was recorded in the ancient book. Therefore, the original location of the Upper Sword Sect should have been reduced to ruins like the cities in the Outer Sword domain. However, when Chu Fengmian investigated the spatial tunnel, he could clearly see that there was a complete palace behind it. Moreover, Chu Fengmian couldn't see any traces of a battle. Moreover, there was only this palace behind the spatial tunnel. There was nothing else. It didn't look like the headquarters of a sect at all. Could it be that the spatial tunnel behind the bronze door doesn't lead to the Upper Sword Sect? Could it be somewhere else? Almost everyone guessed that behind this ancient bronze door should be the location of the Shang Sword Sect. However, after Chu Fengmian's investigation, this was beyond Chu Fengmian's expectations. He suddenly felt that the sudden appearance of the Upper Sword Execution chart wasn't as simple as it seemed. The High Sword Sect had been destroyed tens of millions of years ago, and the High Sword Execution Order chart had disappeared from the 9 regions along with the High Sword Sect for tens of millions of years. This time, it suddenly reappeared after tens of millions of years, and with all these strange phenomena, it was definitely not a coincidence. What is the Upper Sword Sect planning? Chu Fengmian was a bit nervous. Who knew how many invincible experts had appeared in the Shang sword sect? Even if these experts had existed for tens of millions of years, if this was really a method left behind by an immortal emperor, then, even after thousands of years, it was still extremely dangerous. No matter what kind of trick the experts of the upper sword sect left behind, I don't believe that I can't beat a group of dead people. Chu Fengmian's eyes revealed a bit of determination. Wealth came from danger. At this time, he couldn't shrink back. Chu Fengmian wanted to surpass the master of sword Dao and create the world's #1 sword technique. Chu Fengmian must obtain this unparalleled sword technique of the upper sword sect. Just as Chu Fengmian was thinking, the gradually opening ancient bronze door in the center of Sword City was completely opened. The ancient runes and restrictions on the ancient bronze door shattered as soon as the door was opened. It was as if their power had been completely exhausted. The shocking sword intent that erupted from the ancient bronze door gradually dissipated. The ancient bronze door was no longer enveloped by any power, and it was completely open. Let's go! Whoosh! Whoosh! One figure after another flew toward the ancient copper door at a rapid pace. The moment the shocking sword intent disappeared, the sword cultivators in Sword City pushed their escape light to the extreme and flew towards the ancient bronze door. Everyone wanted to seize the opportunity and be the first to enter the ancient bronze door. Chu Fengmian also urged his escape light to fly towards the ancient bronze door in an instant. End of chapter. Chapter 2173. All the sword cultivator powerhouses had been waiting in Sword City. When the sword intent shrouding the ancient bronze gate disappeared, all of them flew in the direction of the ancient bronze gate at the same time. To the experts present, the distance of a few dozen miles was covered in an instant. Among them, the fastest two were the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. The two of them were already prepared. When all the sword cultivators at the scene activated their conveyance lights and flew towards the direction of the ancient bronze door, they suddenly took action. Spiritual swords suddenly flew out from their palms and turned into a sword array, blocking all the sword cultivator experts. The Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master had already rushed over. The sword array that was left behind was to block the other sword cultivator expert. You want to take all the benefits for yourself? No way. The moment the other sword cultivator experts saw the sword formation, they did not need to say anything. All of a sudden, they attacked together. Streaks of shocking sword essence burst out. The sword cultivator experts who came this time were all here for the sword sect's inheritance. How could they be willing to let the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master take all the benefits for themselves? Streaks of sword essence burst out and sword radiance flashed. The remaining 10 sword cultivator experts, including Chu Fengmian, took action together. Countless sword radiance swept down and bombarded the sword array. Crack! Under the joint attack of the 10 sword cultivator experts, the sword array was almost powerless and was shattered into pieces. Even so, it was still able to buy some time. It was enough for the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master to take the lead and enter the ancient copper door. However, when the two of them approached the ancient copper door, the two of them suddenly slowed down. Their faces were solemn. Their celestial powers burst out from their bodies as if they were resisting some kind of power. What's going on? The other sword cultivator experts present were also keenly aware of this, and a hint of seriousness flashed across their eyes. In such an ancient ruin, it was highly likely that there would be some danger. Even though they had taken the initiative to enter the sword sect ruins this time, there might still be some conspiracy behind it. Hence, when they saw the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master suddenly stop, everyone became more cautious. Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Kuan Su Tianci, and the others approached the ancient bronze door quietly. However, The moment they approached the ancient bronze door, their faces revealed the same expression as Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Sword Honorable. The two of them were also unleashing their full power to resist the suppression of that power. There was a power above the ancient bronze door that was suppressing all the martialists and fey immortals that approached it. Only by resisting this suppression could one enter the ancient bronze door. This is the test to enter the sword sect? Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat. He also knew that there were many tests in the upper sword sect. Obtaining the upper sword executor's token only qualified one to compete for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. In order to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect, one had to go through many tests. It seemed that the suppression power above the ancient bronze door was the first test. If one could not even get close to the ancient bronze door and withstand the suppression of that power, one would not be qualified to compete for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. This was the first test to enter the upper sword sect. When Chu Fengmian got close, he also felt a huge force suppressing his body. This huge force was suppressing Chu Fengmian's body, and he could not get rid of it. He could only resist it with his strength. This was the only way. This test tested everyone's strength. No matter how strong one's swordsmanship was, no matter how strong one's comprehension of the sword principle was, it would be meaningless if one did not have strength. Just like Chu Fengmian in his previous life, even though his sword principle was unparalleled, he was still a weakling and meaningless. Although the upper sword sect was a sword principle sect, there were also requirements for the strength of the inheritor. Chu Fengmian felt that this huge pressure was so great that even an ordinary immortal general expert would have to use all his strength to resist it. If one wanted to move forward under this huge pressure, one would have to be at least at the level of Tianxing Jiandi. Under this huge pressure, every step forward was extremely laborious, not to mention flying in the air. Flying Sword Emperor, Blood Shadow Sword Master, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Koan Su Tianci and the others had already landed on the ground. As they activated their powers to resist the tremendous force, they ran towards the direction of the ancient copper door. Chu Fengmian had also landed on the ground. However, this huge force was nothing to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was only a half-step celestial being, but there was still a gap between him and a true immortal general expert in terms of strength. However, resisting this huge pressure not only required strength, but also physical strength. Chu Fengmian's current physical body had already reached the third level of the immortal real body. Even those who had condensed immortal bones were far inferior to Chu Fengmian in terms of physical strength. Using his deathless true body, Chu Fengmian was able to withstand more than 90% of the pressure. Although he couldn't fly, he could still land on the ground as easily as if it were flat ground. Using his movement technique, he hurried toward the copper gate. The group was less than 10 miles away from the ancient copper gate. Even though Chu Fengmian was unable to fly, he could still reach the gate in an instant if he used his movement technique. However, he was using his movement technique now. Chu Fengmian's figure turned into a phantom. In a few breaths, his figure surpassed many figures and rushed towards the ancient bronze door. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's figure surpassed Kungsu Sky Piercer, Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the others. He was only one step away from the Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Sword Master, who were at the front. Moreover, Chu Fengmian's movement technique was so fast that he would catch up with them in the next second. What a fast movement technique! What's wrong with this kid? Is he not under the pressure? Or does he have some kind of immortal weapon that can resist this huge pressure? Seeing Chu Fengmian's figure moving so fast, everyone's eyes were filled with shock. Many of them even showed doubts in their eyes. Although Chu Fengmian's strength was on par with theirs, it was rumored that Chu Fengmian relied on the sword intent of the Master of Sword Dao. Although the sword intent was powerful in battle, it was meaningless in the face of this pressure. In their opinion, Even if Chu Fengmian could withstand this pressure, it was already extremely difficult. However, they did not expect Chu Fengmian to surpass all of them as soon as he exerted his strength. End of chapter. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.